From a Roman road lined with crosses to the shadowed hull of a ship prepared for keel hauling, this is a calm yet haunting journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how a bronze bull was engineered to turn a prisoner's voice into a fiery spectacle, and move deeper into whether the Viking blood eagle was a real ritual or only a fearsome legend. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Brazen Bull of Phalaris, Sicily, 6C BCE. Picture, if you will, the sun-drenched hills of ancient Sicily, where the Mediterranean breeze carries whispers of both olive groves and darker things. It's the 6th century before Christ, and the Greek colony of Akragas, what we'd call Agrigento today, sits perched on its limestone cliffs like a jewel against the azure sea. But this jewel has a shadow, and that shadow has a name: Phalaris. Phalaris wasn't your typical tyrant, though tyranny in ancient Greece had a rather different meaning than what we imagine today. The word tyrannos simply meant someone who seized power outside the traditional aristocratic framework. Some tyrants were beloved by their people. Phalaris, well, Phalaris was not one of those. He ruled Akragas for 16 years. From roughly 570 to 554 BCE, and his reign was marked by an almost artistic cruelty that would echo through history. You see, Phalaris understood something that many rulers throughout time have grasped: that fear, properly cultivated, could be more effective than any army. But how does one cultivate the perfect fear? How does one create a deterrent so terrible, so memorable, that the very thought of rebellion dies before it can take root? The answer came to him in the form of a man named Perillos, a brilliant craftsman and inventor from Athens. Now, Perillos was the kind of man who could look at raw bronze and see possibilities that others couldn't imagine. He was an artist, but also an engineer, someone who understood both the beauty of form and the mechanics of function. When he approached Phalaris with his proposal, he wasn't just offering to create a tool of execution, he was promising to create a masterpiece. The device Perillos described was elegant in its horror. Picture a bull, life-sized and magnificent, cast entirely in bronze. Its surface would gleam in the Sicilian sun, a thing of beauty that might have adorned any temple. But this bull was hollow, and its hollow interior was designed to accommodate a human being. The victim would be placed inside through a door in the bull's side. The door would be sealed, and then came the genius of Perillos's design. Fire would be lit beneath the bronze beast. Bronze, you see, conducts heat magnificently. As the metal heated, the interior would become an oven. But here's where Perillos's artistry truly shone. He had designed an intricate system of pipes and chambers within the bull's head. As the victim inside screamed in agony, their cries would be channeled through these acoustic chambers, emerging from the bull's mouth, not as human screams, but as the bellowing of an actual bull. The bull would appear to come alive, snorting and roaring as real steam emerged from its bronze nostrils. The psychological effect was carefully calculated. Witnesses would see this magnificent bronze creature, this symbol of strength and fertility, apparently animated by divine power. They would hear its otherworldly calls. They would see the steam rising from its form, and they would absolutely know that something beyond the natural world was at work here. The line between execution and religious ritual would blur, and the tyrant would seem to command powers beyond mortal understanding. Phalaris was delighted. Here was intimidation elevated to art, terror refined to its purest essence. The bull was commissioned immediately, and Perillos set to work with the fervor of a man creating his masterpiece. Day after day, the bronze took shape under his careful hands. The acoustic chambers were precisely calculated, the heating mechanisms perfectly engineered. Every detail was considered, every aspect refined. But when Perillos delivered his completed work to Phalaris, something happened that the inventor had not anticipated. The tyrant examined the bull with great interest, walking around it, studying its lines, testing its mechanisms. Then he turned to Perillos with what contemporary accounts describe as a smile, though whether it was admiration or something far colder is lost to history. "This is magnificent," Phalaris is said to have remarked. "Truly, this is craftsmanship beyond compare. But tell me, my dear Perillos, how can I be certain it works as you describe? How can I trust that the acoustic effects will be as stunning as you promise?" Perillos, filled with the pride of any artist being praised for his work, eagerly explained the mechanisms again. He demonstrated how the doors would seal, how the pipes would channel sound, how the entire system was designed to work in perfect harmony. And then Phalaris made a suggestion that must have struck Perillos like lightning. "But surely," the tyrant said, "the only way to truly test such a device is to try it with a human subject. And who better than the inventor himself? After all, you understand its workings better than anyone. You could tell us if any adjustments need to be made." The ancient sources don't record Perillos's reaction to this suggestion, but we can imagine the moment when the inventor realized his situation. This was no longer about craftsmanship or artistic achievement. This was about survival, and his chances were rapidly diminishing. Some accounts suggest that Perillos tried to flee, others that he attempted to reason with Phalaris, pointing out the injustice of executing the very person who had provided such a valuable service. But Phalaris was unmoved. In his mind, the logic was perfect. Perillos had created an instrument of ultimate cruelty, had lovingly crafted a device designed to inflict the most agonizing death imaginable. What kind of man creates such a thing? What kind of mind conceives such suffering? And so Perillos became the first victim of his own creation. The bronze door was opened, the inventor was forced inside, and the door was sealed with the same precision he had built into its design. The fires were lit beneath the bull, and as the bronze began to heat, the device performed exactly as its creator had promised. The witnesses reported that the bull's roars were magnificent and terrible, seeming to come from some divine source rather than human suffering. The steam rose from its nostrils in perfect clouds, the bronze gleamed in the firelight, and the entire spectacle had exactly the effect Phalaris had desired. Fear rippled through the crowd like a physical thing, and word of the tyrant's incredible power spread throughout Sicily and beyond. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. According to several ancient historians, Phalaris didn't allow Perillos to die in his bronze creation. Just as the screams reached their crescendo, just as the bull's roars became most magnificent, the tyrant ordered the fires extinguished and the door opened. Perillos was dragged from the bull more dead than alive, his body broken by the heat and his mind shattered by the experience. Why? Some suggest it was mercy, but this seems unlikely given Phalaris's reputation. More probable is that the tyrant recognized the value of having a living testament to his power. Perillos, broken and traumatized, could serve as a walking reminder of what happened to those who displeased the ruler of Akragas. The inventor lived, but he lived as a broken man, a living ghost haunted by his own creation. The brazen bull became Phalaris's signature method of execution, used not just for common criminals, but for anyone who posed a threat to his rule. Political rivals, rebellious citizens, captured enemies, all could find themselves face to face with the beautiful bronze beast. The bull became a symbol of Akragas, known throughout the Greek world as the ultimate expression of tyrannical power. The psychological impact extended far beyond Sicily. Other tyrants began commissioning their own instruments of terror, each trying to outdo Phalaris in creativity and cruelty. The bull influenced the development of execution methods throughout the ancient world, establishing a template for using fear as a tool of governance. Eventually, of course, Phalaris's reign came to an end, as all tyrannies must. In 554 BCE, he was overthrown by a popular uprising led by a man named Telemachus. And in one of history's more poetic moments of justice, Phalaris himself was executed, some sources say, in his own bronze bull, though others suggest he was simply stoned to death by an angry mob. The bull itself survived its creator's fall, becoming something of a curiosity and then a legend. Various ancient writers claim to have seen it, though these claims become less credible as time passed. By the Roman era, the bull had become more myth than reality, a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the inevitable fall of tyrants. But the legacy of Perillos and his bronze bull extended far beyond any single regime. The device became a symbol in Greek literature of hubris punished, of the inventor destroyed by his own creation. Philosophers used it as an example when discussing the nature of justice, asking whether Perillos deserved his fate or whether Phalaris's cruelty exceeded all bounds of civilized behavior. The story reminds us of something profound about human nature, that our greatest creative capacities can be turned toward the most destructive ends. Perillos was not a sadistic monster. He was a skilled craftsman who allowed his pride in his work to blind him to its moral implications. In pursuing perfection in his art, he created something perfectly awful. Crucifixion along the Appian Way, Rome, 71 BCE. The Roman sun beat down mercilessly on the ancient stone road, stretching from Rome toward the southern port city of Brundisium. This was the Appian Way, the queen of roads, a marvel of engineering that had carried Roman legions to countless victories across the Mediterranean world. But in the spring of 71 BCE, it carried something else entirely, a message written in human suffering that would echo through history. The road stretched for miles, its carefully fitted stones worn smooth by countless feet, hooves, and wheels. On this particular day, however, travelers would have noticed something horrifying lining both sides of the famous highway. Every 120 feet, a wooden cross rose against the Italian sky, and on each cross hung the body of a man who had dared to challenge the might of Rome. 6,000 crosses, 6,000 human beings, dying slowly under the Mediterranean sun. This was not random violence or the chaos of battle. This was calculated, methodical, and designed to send a message that would resonate throughout the Roman world for generations. This was Rome's response to the greatest slave rebellion in its history, the uprising led by a gladiator named Spartacus. To understand the full horror of what happened along the Appian Way, we need to step back and understand what had brought Rome to this point. The rebellion had begun 3 years earlier in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. Spartacus, a Thracian warrior who had been enslaved and forced to fight for the entertainment of Roman crowds, had escaped along with about 70 other gladiators. What started as a desperate break for freedom had grown into something far more dangerous, a full-scale war against the Roman state. Spartacus was no ordinary slave. He possessed a brilliant military mind and charismatic leadership that attracted not just runaway gladiators, but thousands upon thousands of slaves from across southern Italy. At its peak, his army numbered over 100,000 men, women, and children, all united by their hatred of Roman oppression and their dream of freedom. For 3 years, this slave army had terrorized the Roman countryside. They had defeated several Roman legions, killing praetors and embarrassing the Senate. They had moved up and down the Italian peninsula almost at will, gathering strength and striking terror into the hearts of Roman citizens. Spartacus had proven that slaves were not the docile, subhuman creatures that Roman propaganda portrayed them to be. He had shown that they could fight, they could win, and they could threaten the very foundations of Roman society. But by 71 BCE, the tide had finally turned. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious men, had been given command of a massive army, specifically assembled to crush the rebellion once and for all. Crassus understood that his political future depended on success where others had failed. He could not simply defeat Spartacus. He had to obliterate him and his followers so thoroughly that no slave would ever again dare to dream of rebellion. The end came in the mountainous region of southern Italy, near the town of Petelia. Spartacus, attempting to ferry his followers across to Sicily, where they might find safety, was trapped by Crassus's forces. The final battle was brutal and decisive. Spartacus himself fell fighting, sword in hand, trying to reach Crassus personally and end the war with a single stroke. His body was so hacked apart in the melee that it was never identified among the thousands of corpses scattered across the battlefield. But Spartacus's death was not the end of Crassus's revenge, it was only the beginning. Of the slave army that had once numbered over 100,000, about 6,000 had survived the final battle. These prisoners were not treated as prisoners of war, because in Roman law, they were not warriors, they were property that had damaged itself and caused tremendous trouble for its owners. What happened next was as much about psychology as it was about punishment. Crassus ordered all 6,000 prisoners to be crucified along the length of the Appian Way, from Capua, where the rebellion had begun, all the way to Rome itself. This was not a decision made in the heat of battle or the passion of victory. This was a carefully calculated act of terror, planned and executed with typical Roman efficiency. The logistics of crucifying 6,000 people were staggering. Each cross had to be constructed, transported, and erected. The condemned had to be processed, likely branded or marked to identify their crimes, and then assigned to specific crosses. Teams of soldiers and craftsmen worked along the road for days, turning Rome's greatest highway into a corridor of death. The crucifixion process itself was designed to maximize suffering while prolonging life. Victims were typically flogged first, their backs torn open by whips embedded with pieces of metal and bone. Then they were forced to carry their own crossbeams to the place of execution, though with 6,000 victims, this ceremonial aspect may have been abbreviated for efficiency. The actual crucifixion involved nailing or tying the victim to the cross in a position that made breathing extremely difficult. Contrary to popular imagery, most victims were not nailed through their palms. The weight of a human body would simply tear through the flesh between the fingers. Instead, the nails were driven through the wrists and ankles, securing the victim to the wood while causing maximum agony. Death by crucifixion was not quick. Most victims survived for days, dying slowly from a combination of blood loss, dehydration, exposure, and asphyxiation. As their strength failed, they could no longer lift themselves up to breathe properly, and they would suffocate. The process was so reliably slow that Roman guards could predict with reasonable accuracy when a victim would die. Along the Appian Way, travelers would have witnessed every stage of this process. Some of the crucified would have been freshly hung, still strong enough to cry out or struggle. Others would have been hanging for days, their voices reduced to whispers, their bodies swollen and discolored. Still others would have been already dead, their corpses left hanging as a warning to others. The psychological impact on travelers was exactly what Crassus intended. Anyone traveling between Rome and southern Italy, merchants, soldiers, officials, slaves, would have to pass through this forest of human suffering. They would see what happened to those who challenged Roman authority. They would smell the stench of death and decay. They would hear the moans and cries of the dying. And they would remember, Roman law typically required that crucified criminals be left hanging until their bodies decomposed completely. This served multiple purposes. It prevented the executed from receiving proper burial rites, which Romans believed was necessary for the soul's rest, and it provided a long-lasting deterrent effect. The crosses along the Appian Way remained occupied for weeks, creating a 120-mile-long monument to Roman power and slave rebellion's futility. Contemporary accounts describe the horror that travelers experienced. Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing years later, mentioned how the sight of the crosses had affected even hardened Roman soldiers. Foreign ambassadors traveling to Rome reported back to their home cities about the terrible display of Roman justice. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy Rome. But the crucifixions along the Appian Way represented more than just punishment. They represented a fundamental aspect of Roman society. Rome was built on slavery. Historians estimate that slaves made up between 25% and 30% of the population in Roman Italy. These were not just household servants or farm workers, but skilled craftsmen, teachers, doctors, and administrators. The entire Roman economy depended on slave labor. Spartacus's rebellion had threatened this foundation. He had proven that slaves could organize, fight, and win. He had shown that they possessed the same courage, intelligence, and military skill as their masters. This was a deeply disturbing revelation for Roman society, which justified slavery partly on the belief that slaves were naturally inferior beings, deserving of their fate. The mass crucifixion was therefore not just about deterring future rebellions. It was about reasserting Roman beliefs about the natural order of society. By displaying the broken bodies of the rebels along their most famous road, the Romans were declaring that slaves were indeed inferior, that their brief moment of success had been an aberration, and that the natural order had been restored. The religious implications were equally important. Romans believed that proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. By denying the crucified rebels burial, and by leaving their bodies to be consumed by birds and wild animals, the Romans were condemning them not just in this world, but in the next. This was spiritual as well as physical annihilation. Yet even as the crosses lined the Appian Way, the Romans could not entirely suppress their unease about what Spartacus had accomplished. The rebellion had revealed uncomfortable truths about Roman society, that their slaves hated them, that their military was not invincible, that their empire rested on foundations far more fragile than they had imagined. The crucifixions ended, eventually. The bodies decomposed, the crosses were taken down, and normal traffic resumed on the Appian Way. But the memory lingered. Roman historians would write about Spartacus for centuries, usually with a mixture of condemnation and grudging admiration. They could not help but respect the courage and skill of a man who had come closer than anyone to bringing down the Roman Republic. The rebellion and its aftermath also influenced Roman policy toward slaves. While they never abandoned slavery, Roman masters became more cautious about how they treated their human property. They understood now that slaves were not passive victims but potential enemies who might strike back if pushed too far. The Appian Way itself continued to serve as Rome's highway to the south for centuries, carrying armies, merchants, and travelers. But for those who knew their history, it also served as a reminder of what happened when someone dared to challenge the might of Rome. The stones beneath their feet had once been stained with the blood of 6,000 rebels, and the very air they breathed had once carried the cries of the dying. Scourging, crucifixion of Jesus Judea, 30 CE. The morning air in Jerusalem was heavy with tension as Pontius Pilate took his seat on the judgment bench outside the Praetorium. It was during Passover season, when thousands of Jewish pilgrims crowded into the Holy City, and emotions ran particularly high. The Roman prefect of Judea had governed this troublesome province for nearly a decade, and he had learned to navigate its complex religious and political currents with the wary pragmatism of a career administrator. But this morning would test his diplomatic skills like never before. Before him stood a man who had become the center of a storm that threatened to engulf the entire city. Jesus of Nazareth, a wandering preacher whose followers claimed he was the long-awaited Messiah, had been arrested the night before and delivered to Pilate by the Jewish religious authorities. The charges were serious: sedition against Rome, claiming to be a king, stirring up the people. In the volatile atmosphere of occupied Judea, such accusations could not be taken lightly. The political situation was extraordinarily delicate. Pilate governed at the pleasure of the Emperor Tiberius, and his position depended on maintaining order in one of Rome's most restless provinces. He had already faced criticism from Rome for his harsh methods, and another major uprising could end his career or worse. At the same time, he had to work with the Jewish religious establishment, particularly the high priest Caiaphas, who collaborated with Rome to keep the peace. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish governing council, had already tried Jesus according to their own laws and found him guilty of blasphemy, but they lacked the authority to carry out executions. Only Roman officials could impose the death penalty. So they had brought him to Pilate, reframing their religious accusations in political terms that would concern a Roman governor. They claimed Jesus had forbidden paying taxes to Caesar and had declared himself a king. Pilate questioned Jesus directly, and the conversation that followed would become one of the most analyzed dialogues in human history. "Are you the king of the Jews?" the prefect asked. Jesus' response was enigmatic. "My kingdom is not of this world." Here was a man who spoke in riddles, who seemed utterly unconcerned with the mortal danger he faced, who claimed authority from sources beyond Roman comprehension. The prefect found himself in an impossible position. His investigation had uncovered no evidence of sedition or rebellion. Jesus had no army, no political organization, no apparent plans to overthrow Roman rule. Yet the Jewish leaders were insistent, and they had begun to make veiled threats. If Pilate released someone they claimed was a threat to Caesar, they suggested, perhaps Caesar himself should hear about the prefect's judgment. In a desperate attempt to resolve the situation without blood, Pilate tried several maneuvers. He sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, hoping to shift responsibility. When that failed, he offered to release Jesus as part of the Passover tradition of pardoning a prisoner. But the crowd, influenced by the religious leaders, chose instead to free Barabbas, a genuine revolutionary who had committed murder during an uprising. Finally, hoping to satisfy the bloodlust while avoiding execution, Pilate ordered Jesus to be scourged. This was no mere flogging. Roman scourging was a brutal punishment designed to bring victims to the very edge of death. The whip used was called a flagrum, a multi-thonged device embedded with pieces of metal, bone, and stone. Each stroke tore flesh, and experienced Roman soldiers knew exactly how much punishment a man could endure without dying. The scourging took place in the courtyard of the Praetorium, away from public view but within earshot of the crowds outside. Jesus was stripped and tied to a post, his back exposed to the whips of the Roman soldiers. The flagrum bit deep with each stroke, opening long wounds that would have bled profusely. After 39 lashes, one short of the number that Jewish law considered potentially fatal, Jesus would have been barely conscious, his back a mass of torn flesh and flowing blood. But the soldiers were not finished. In a cruel parody of royal investiture, they placed a crown of thorns on Jesus' head, the long spines driving deep into his scalp. They draped a purple robe around his bleeding shoulders and placed a reed in his hand as a mock scepter. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they cried, striking him repeatedly in the face and spitting on him. When Pilate brought the tortured man before the crowd, he may have hoped that the sight of Jesus, bloody, broken, barely human, would satisfy their desire for punishment. "Ecce homo," he said, "behold the man." But the crowd's bloodlust had not been satisfied. They demanded crucifixion, the most degrading and agonizing death that Roman law could impose. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals, slaves, rebels, and those who challenged Roman authority. It was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate and terrorize. The condemned would typically carry their own crossbeam through the streets to the place of execution, providing a public spectacle that warned others against similar crimes. The procession from the Praetorium to Golgotha, the place of the skull outside Jerusalem's walls, became known as the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. Jesus, weakened by the scourging and loss of blood, struggled under the weight of the wooden beam. The Gospel accounts tell us that a man named Simon of Cyrene was pressed into service to carry the cross when Jesus could no longer manage it. At Golgotha, the mechanics of crucifixion proceeded with Roman efficiency. The crossbeam was laid on the ground, and Jesus' arms were stretched along it. The soldiers drove nails through his wrists, not his palms, which could not support the body's weight. Then the beam was hoisted up and attached to the vertical post that was permanently installed at the execution site. A smaller nail was driven through his feet, pinning them to the upright. The position was carefully calculated to maximize suffering while prolonging life. The victim's weight pulled down on the arms, making breathing extremely difficult. To draw breath, the condemned had to push up on their feet, pressing against the nail and causing excruciating pain. This cycle of suffocation and agony could continue for hours or even days. Above Jesus' head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be placed: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. This was standard practice, proclaiming the crime for which the victim was dying. But it also represented Pilate's final act of defiance against the Jewish leaders who had forced his hand. They had demanded that Jesus die for claiming to be their king. Very well, then he would die with that title proclaimed for all to see. 2 other men were crucified alongside Jesus, criminals whose crimes were deemed worthy of this terrible death. The 3 crosses formed a grim tableau against the Jerusalem sky, visible to travelers on the roads and to citizens going about their daily business. This visibility was intentional. Crucifixion was meant to be public, a deterrent that would discourage others from challenging Roman authority. The crowds that gathered at Golgotha were a mixture of the curious, the faithful, and the hostile. Some came to mock, others to mourn. The soldiers sat nearby, dividing Jesus' clothing among themselves and gambling for his seamless robe. This casual attitude toward the suffering of the condemned was typical for Roman soldiers. Crucifixion was routine work, no more emotionally significant than any other administrative task. As the hours passed, Jesus spoke several times from the cross. His words, recorded differently in various gospel accounts, reflected both his physical agony and his spiritual mission. He asked forgiveness for his executioners, assured one of the criminals crucified beside him of paradise, and cried out in anguish, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words from Psalm 22 that would have been immediately recognizable to the Jewish observers. The manner of Jesus' death was unusual for crucifixion victims. Most survived for days, dying slowly of exhaustion, dehydration, and asphyxiation. But Jesus died within hours, possibly hastened by the severe scourging he had endured and the psychological trauma of his ordeal. His death was confirmed when a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear, releasing a flow of blood and water that indicated cardiac arrest. Even in death, Jesus' case remained unusual. Normally, crucified criminals were left hanging until their bodies decomposed, but Jewish law required that bodies be taken down before the Sabbath. A wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea received permission from Pilate to remove the body and place it in a new tomb carved from rock. This proper burial was itself remarkable. Most crucifixion victims were thrown into common graves or left for scavengers. The political and religious implications of Jesus' execution would resonate far beyond that Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. For the Roman authorities, it seemed like a successful resolution to a potentially explosive situation. The troublesome preacher was dead, his followers scattered, and order was maintained. Pilate had navigated the crisis without alienating either Rome or the Jewish leadership. But the crucifixion of Jesus would prove to be anything but the end of the story. Within days, his followers were claiming that he had risen from the dead. Within decades, a new religion was spreading throughout the Roman Empire, transforming the instrument of his execution into a symbol of hope and salvation. The cross, once a sign of shame and defeat, became the central image of Christianity. The methods used to execute Jesus' scourging and crucifixion were typical of Roman justice in the 1st century. Thousands of people died in exactly the same way throughout the empire's long history. What made this particular execution unique was not its method, but its meaning, not its brutality, but its aftermath. The Romans had intended Jesus' death to serve as a warning, a demonstration of what happened to those who challenged the established order. Instead, it became the founding moment of a movement that would eventually transform the very empire that had killed him. The empire that perfected crucifixion as a tool of terror would, within 3 centuries, adopt the crucified man as its official deity. The irony was profound. Rome's most degrading punishment became Christianity's most sacred symbol, and the man whose death was meant to end a movement became the cornerstone of the world's largest religion. Immurement of Vestal violators. Rome, Honest CE. In the heart of ancient Rome, where the Forum buzzed with the daily business of the world's greatest empire, stood a temple that housed one of the city's most sacred and dangerous institutions. The Temple of Vesta, circular, like the primitive huts of Rome's legendary founders, contained the eternal flame that symbolized the very life of the Roman state. And tending this flame were 6 women whose lives were bound by vows so sacred that breaking them meant not just death, but a death so terrible that it was whispered about in corners and rarely spoken of directly. These were the Vestal Virgins, and their story is one of honor and horror intertwined, of religious devotion pushed to its most extreme conclusion, of a society so obsessed with purity and divine favor that it was willing to bury its priestesses alive to maintain the gods' goodwill. The Vestals were chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families of unimpeachable reputation. Once selected, they would serve for 30 years, 10 years learning their duties, 10 years performing them at their peak, and 10 years training their successors. After 3 decades of service, they were free to leave the temple and even marry, though few chose to do so. The life of a Vestal was one of immense privilege and equally immense restriction. In Roman society, these women held a unique position. They were legally independent, owning property in their own right, something almost unheard of for Roman women. They could make wills, free slaves, and even had the power to pardon condemned criminals if they encountered them on their way to execution. They had the best seats at public games and festivals, and their very presence was considered a blessing. When they walked through the streets of Rome, crowds would part respectfully, and even the most important officials would acknowledge their status. But this privilege came at a price that would be unimaginable to modern minds. The Vestals were required to maintain absolute chastity throughout their 30 years of service. This wasn't merely a matter of religious propriety, it was literally a matter of life and death for both the individual, Vestal, and the Roman state itself. The Romans believed that the purity of the Vestals was directly connected to the welfare of the empire. If a Vestal maintained her chastity, Rome would prosper. If she violated her vows, disaster would follow: military defeats, plagues, earthquakes, famines. The eternal flame itself was seen as a physical manifestation of this connection. Should the flame ever be extinguished, it was taken as a sign that the gods had withdrawn their protection from Rome. This belief created an atmosphere of constant vigilance and paranoia around the Vestals. Any misfortune that befell Rome might be attributed to secret unchastity among the priestesses. Political enemies might spread rumors about a Vestal's conduct to explain military defeats or natural disasters. The intersection of religion, politics, and sexuality created a perfect storm of suspicion and fear. When accusations of unchastity arose, the investigation was conducted with all the solemnity and terror appropriate to a crime that threatened the very existence of the Roman state. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would conduct the inquiry. Slaves would be tortured for information, associates questioned under threat, and every aspect of the accused Vestal's life scrutinized for signs of impropriety. If found guilty, the punishment was unlike any other in Roman law. The Vestal could not simply be executed. Her blood could not be shed by human hands, as this would further pollute the sacred relationship between Rome and its gods. Instead, she would face a death so horrible that it seems designed more to appease outraged deities than to punish human crime. She would be buried alive. The process of immurement was conducted with all the ritual solemnity that Romans brought to their most important religious ceremonies. The condemned Vestal would be placed in an underground chamber called a columbarium, literally a dovecote, near the Colline Gate of Rome. This wasn't a crude pit dug for the occasion, but a purpose-built chamber, stone-lined and carefully constructed for this most terrible purpose. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a person to lie down, but it was not entirely empty. The Romans, in what might have been mercy or might have been a final cruel joke, would provide the condemned Vestal with a small amount of food, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a small lamp, and a bed. These provisions would sustain life for perhaps a few days, extending the agony while maintaining the legal fiction that the Vestal was not being directly killed by human hands. She was simply being placed in a chamber and allowed to die of natural causes. The chamber would be sealed from above with heavy stones or a metal grate and then covered with earth. The location would be marked, but not prominently. This was not meant to be a monument, but a place of shame, a necessary evil that Rome preferred to forget as quickly as possible. The psychological horror of this death is almost beyond imagination. The condemned woman would find herself in absolute darkness, in a space barely large enough to move, with only the sound of her own breathing and heartbeat for company. The walls would press in around her, the air would grow stale, and she would know that above her, life in Rome continued as normal, while she slowly died in her stone tomb. The duration of survival in such conditions would depend on many factors: the amount of air in the chamber, the person's physical condition, their psychological state. Some might survive for days, slowly consuming their meager provisions while hoping against hope for rescue that would never come. Others might die more quickly from the psychological shock of their situation. All would face the ultimate terror of conscious death, aware of every moment as their strength failed and their life slowly ebbed away. The Romans justified this horrific punishment in several ways. First, it preserved the legal fiction that they were not shedding the blood of a sacred person. The Vestal would die, technically, of natural causes: starvation, dehydration, or suffocation, rather than by direct human action. This satisfied their religious scruples, while still removing the source of divine displeasure. Second, the method ensured that the punishment matched the crime in symbolic terms. Just as the Vestal had violated the boundary between sacred and profane, between pure and impure, so she would be placed in a boundary space between life and death, between the world above and the underworld below. She would die in isolation, cut off from human contact, just as her crime had cut Rome off from divine favor. The cases where this punishment was actually carried out were rare but memorable. Perhaps the most famous occurred during the reign of Domitian in the late 1st century CE. The emperor, seeking to restore traditional Roman religious practices after years of what he saw as moral decline, ordered a thorough investigation into the conduct of the Vestal virgins. The investigation revealed, or claimed to reveal, that the chief Vestal, Cornelia, had been conducting an affair with a former consul. Under interrogation and torture, several slaves confirmed the allegations, though we can never know whether their testimony was truthful or extracted through unbearable pain. Cornelia herself maintained her innocence until the end. But Domitian was determined to make an example. The emperor's decision to execute Cornelia was as much about politics as religion. Domitian was facing criticism for his authoritarian rule and his expensive building projects. By positioning himself as the defender of traditional Roman values against moral corruption, he could deflect attention from his other problems, while demonstrating his piety and resolve. The execution of Cornelia followed the ancient rituals precisely. She was carried to the place of immurement in a covered litter, as befitted her status, but the covering also served to hide her from the eyes of the public. Looking upon a condemned Vestal was considered unlucky. The procession moved through streets lined with silent crowds, for this was not an occasion for celebration or demonstration, but for solemn religious observance. At the Colline Gate, the chamber had been prepared according to ancient custom. Cornelia was allowed to descend into it. Under her own power, she could not be physically forced, as this would constitute violence against a sacred person. Contemporary accounts suggest that she maintained her dignity to the end, adjusting her robes carefully as she lay down in the chamber and speaking a final prayer to Vesta. The sealing of the chamber was done with elaborate ceremony. The Pontifex Maximus spoke the ritual words, calling upon the gods to witness that justice was being done and asking them to restore their favor to Rome. Earth was piled over the sealed entrance, and the site was marked with a small stone bearing only the date, no name, no inscription that might preserve the memory of this necessary but shameful act. But the horror of Cornelia's death did not end with the sealing of her tomb. For days afterward, Romans reported hearing sounds from beneath the earth, scratching, tapping, even muffled cries. Whether these sounds were real or imagined, whether they came from the dying Vestal or from some other source, they added to the psychological terror that surrounded the entire proceeding. The city held its breath, waiting to see whether the gods would accept this sacrifice and restore their protection to Rome. The aftermath of such executions reveals much about Roman psychology and the burden of maintaining their complex relationship with the divine. On one hand, there was relief that the source of divine displeasure had been removed and that proper piety had been restored. On the other hand, there was unease about the terrible price that had been paid. Even Romans who fully believed in the necessity of the execution found themselves troubled by its brutality. This unease expressed itself in various ways. Some Romans began to question whether the evidence against condemned Vestals was truly sufficient, whether political motivations might have influenced what should have been purely religious decisions. Others wondered whether such extreme punishments were truly what the gods desired, or whether they reflected more about human fear than divine will. The immurement of Vestal virgins also reveals the impossible position that Roman society created for these women. They were simultaneously the most honored and most endangered people in the empire. Their status placed them above ordinary mortals, but it also made them scapegoats for every disaster that befell Rome. They lived lives of privilege that most Romans could never imagine, but they did so under the constant threat of the most horrible death their society could devise. The psychological pressure on the Vestals themselves must have been enormous. They were required to maintain not just their physical chastity, but the appearance of perfect purity in all things. A careless gesture, an unguarded expression, a moment of normal human warmth could be misinterpreted as evidence of impropriety. They lived under constant observation, knowing that their lives depended not just on their own conduct, but on how that conduct was perceived by others. The institution of the Vestal virgins and their terrible punishment for unchastity persisted for centuries, surviving the fall of the Republic and continuing well into the imperial period. It was not until the late 4th century CE, when Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, that the Temple of Vesta was finally closed and the eternal flame extinguished forever. The end came not with dramatic executions or public outcry, but with the quiet administrative efficiency that characterized the late empire's approach to religious reform. Emperor Theodosius I, as part of his campaign to establish Christianity as Rome's sole religion, simply defunded the temple and dismissed the Vestals. The women were pensioned off, the sacred flame was allowed to die, and one of Rome's oldest and most distinctive religious institutions vanished into history. But the legacy of the Vestal virgins and their horrific punishment lived on in Roman memory and in the literature that preserved their stories. Later writers, both Christian and pagan, would look back on the practice of immurement with fascination and horror. For Christians, it became evidence of the cruelty and superstition of pagan Rome. For those who mourned the passing of traditional Roman values, it represented the kind of absolute commitment to duty and honor that had made Rome great. The practice of immurement as punishment for religious violations was not unique to Rome. Similar punishments existed in other ancient cultures, but nowhere else was it so systematized, so ritualized, or so closely tied to the perceived welfare of an entire state. The Romans created a system where individual human lives became expendable in the service of maintaining cosmic order, where the most honored members of society could become its victims when that order seemed threatened. The story of the Vestal virgins and their buried alive punishment serves as a reminder of how religious devotion, when taken to extremes, can lead to unimaginable cruelty. It shows us a society so terrified of losing divine protection that it was willing to sacrifice its most sacred servants to maintain that protection. And it demonstrates the terrible burden that societies place on individuals when they make them responsible not just for their own conduct, but for the welfare of everyone around them. In the end, the immurement of the Vestal virgins stands as one of history's most chilling examples of ritualized terror. a practice that combined religious devotion, social control, and raw fear into a form of execution so horrible that even those who carried it out seemed to recognize its monstrosity. It reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we would like to believe, and that the most terrible cruelties can be justified when we convince ourselves that the stakes are high enough. Death by soaring Persia, 3rd CE. The great palace of Ctesiphon, capital of the Sassanid Persian Empire, shimmered in the heat of the Mesopotamian sun as courtiers and servants went about their daily routines in the 3rd century of the Common Era. This was the heart of one of the world's great powers, rival to Rome itself, heir to the ancient Persian traditions that stretched back to Cyrus the Great. But on this particular day, the normal bustle of palace life was overshadowed by something far more sinister, the implementation of a punishment so terrible that even hardened Persian nobles found excuses to be elsewhere when it was carried out. The Sassanid kings ruled an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Persian Gulf. They were the heirs of ancient Persian traditions of absolute monarchy, divine kingship, and elaborate court ritual. But they were also practitioners of a form of justice that could be breathtakingly cruel, even by the standards of the ancient world. And no punishment in their arsenal was more feared than death by soaring. The victim on this day was a man who had once stood high in the royal favor, a satrap or provincial governor who had ruled one of the empire's wealthy eastern provinces with what had appeared to be loyal efficiency. His name was Hormizd, and he had served the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, faithfully for over a decade. His administration had been competent, his tax collection efficient, his military service adequate. But Hormizd had made a fatal error. He had been caught in secret negotiations with Roman agents, apparently planning to defect with his province to the enemy empire. Treason against the Persian crown was not merely a political crime. It was a religious offense of the highest order. The Sassanid kings ruled by divine mandate, chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian religion. To betray the king was to betray God himself, to upset the cosmic order that kept the world in balance between light and darkness, truth and falsehood. Such a crime demanded a punishment that would not only end the traitor's life, but serve as a terrible warning to others who might consider similar betrayal. The method chosen was one that the Persian court had refined over centuries of practice. Death by sawing was not a quick execution born of anger or passion, but a calculated procedure designed to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror. It was a punishment that could take hours to complete, during which the victim would remain conscious and aware for most of the ordeal. The preparation for such an execution was as elaborate as any royal ceremony. The saw itself was specially made for the purpose, not the crude tools used by carpenters or woodcutters, but a finely crafted instrument designed specifically for cutting through human bone and flesh. Some accounts describe saws with teeth of different sizes and sharpness, allowing for varying degrees of pain and different rates of cutting. The most sophisticated versions were said to have been designed by court physicians who understood human anatomy well enough to prolong life and consciousness as long as possible. The location was carefully chosen as well. Persian executions were typically public affairs, but death by sawing was so horrible that it was usually carried out in a more restricted setting, the courtyard of the palace, or a designated execution ground where only nobles, officials, and other important witnesses would be present. The goal was not mass entertainment, but the education of those whose loyalty to the crown was most important. Hormizd was brought to the execution ground in chains, but even in his final moments, he was treated with a certain respect due to his former rank. He was allowed to speak, to make a final statement, though what he said has not been preserved in the historical records. Some condemned men used these moments to beg for mercy, others to protest their innocence, still others to curse their enemies. A few, according to the chroniclers, maintained their dignity to the end, accepting their fate with the stoicism that Persian culture admired. The actual method of sawing varied depending on whether the execution was meant to be relatively quick or deliberately prolonged. In the more merciful version, if mercy is the right word for such a context, the victim would be suspended head down and sawed from the groin downward. This position ensured maximum blood flow to the brain, keeping the victim conscious longer, but it also meant that vital organs would be reached relatively quickly, leading to death within perhaps an hour. But for cases of high treason, like Hormizds, the more prolonged method was typically employed. The victim would be restrained upright, often tied to a wooden frame, and the sawing would begin at the extremities, perhaps the feet or hands, and work slowly toward the torso. This method could extend the ordeal for many hours, as the loss of blood would be gradual and no immediately vital organs would be damaged until the very end. The psychological torture was as carefully calculated as the physical. The victim could see the saw approaching, could watch as it bit into their flesh, could feel every stroke as it cut deeper into bone and tissue. The sound alone, the rhythmic scraping of metal against bone, was said to be enough to drive witnesses to nausea and sometimes to unconsciousness. Persian court records, maintained with typical administrative efficiency, preserved detailed accounts of such executions. These documents, discovered centuries later by Islamic historians, describe not only the methods used, but the reactions of witnesses and the time required for the victim to die. In Hormizd's case, the execution reportedly lasted from sunrise to midday, approximately 6 hours of systematic cutting. The witnesses to such executions were carefully chosen. They included other provincial governors, high military officers, court officials, and foreign ambassadors. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who betray the Persian crown. The presence of foreign diplomats was particularly important, as they would report back to their own rulers about Persian methods of justice, potentially discouraging them from attempting to suborn Persian officials. But the sawing execution served purposes beyond simple deterrence. In Persian religious thought, heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, the manner of death affected the soul's journey in the afterlife. A traitor who died quickly might find mercy in the next world, but one who suffered extensively would carry that suffering into eternity. The prolonged agony was thus both earthly punishment and spiritual damnation. The method also reflected Persian concepts of justice that required the punishment to fit the crime in symbolic as well as practical terms. Treason was seen as a form of cutting, severing the sacred bonds between subject and sovereign, tearing apart the fabric of the empire. The traitor would therefore be literally cut apart, their body dismembered, as they had dismembered the body politic. The technical aspects of death by sawing reveal the methodical nature of Persian cruelty. Court physicians would sometimes be present to monitor the victim's condition, administering stimulants if consciousness seemed to be fading too quickly, or applying tourniquets to slow blood loss and extend the ordeal. The goal was to keep the victim aware and suffering for as long as humanly possible. The psychological effect on the executioners themselves was also carefully managed. The actual sawing was typically carried out by specially trained slaves or condemned criminals who had been offered the choice between performing executions and facing execution themselves. These men were kept isolated from normal court life and were often executed themselves after completing their service, partly to prevent them from revealing the technical details of their work, and partly because their close contact with such extreme cruelty was thought to contaminate them spiritually. Word of executions like Hormizd's spread throughout the empire with remarkable speed, carried by the efficient Persian postal system and embellished by merchants, soldiers, and travelers. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legends of Persian cruelty that served the crown's purposes even better than the actual events. A satrap in a distant province might never witness a sawing execution, but he would certainly hear the stories, and those stories would influence his decisions when approached by foreign agents or tempted by thoughts of rebellion. The practice of death by sawing was not unique to Persia. Variations existed in other ancient cultures, including some Greek city-states and various kingdoms in Asia Minor. but the Persians developed it to an unprecedented level of systematic cruelty, creating detailed protocols for different types of treason and different degrees of suffering. They maintained records of executions, studied the most effective methods, and refined their techniques over generations. The influence of Persian execution methods extended far beyond their own borders. When Islamic armies conquered the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century, they found detailed manuals describing various execution techniques, including sawing. Some of these methods were adopted by Islamic rulers, though usually in modified forms that reflected Islamic legal principles. The Abbasid caliphs, ruling from Baghdad, employed variations of Persian execution methods for centuries. The end of systematic death by sawing in Persia came gradually, not through any single reform or moment of enlightenment, but through the slow evolution of Islamic jurisprudence and changing concepts of justice. Islamic law recognized fewer crimes as deserving of execution, and those that did warrant death were typically carried out more quickly and with less elaborate cruelty. The theological framework that had justified extreme suffering in this world as preparation for the next was replaced by concepts of divine mercy and the possibility of repentance. But the legacy of Persian execution methods lived on in the historical memory and in the literature of subsequent civilizations. Islamic historians preserved accounts of Sassanid cruelty partly as examples of pre-Islamic barbarism overcome by the mercy of Allah, but partly also as cautionary tales about the dangers of absolute power unchecked by divine law. The story of death by sawing in ancient Persia serves as a reminder of how far human cruelty can extend when it is systematized, ritualized, and justified by religious or political ideology. It shows us a civilization that was capable of great achievements in art, architecture, literature, and governance, but that was also willing to inflict unimaginable suffering on individuals in service of state power. The Persian method of execution by sawing stands as one of history's most methodical approaches to inflicting death, a technique refined over centuries into a precise instrument of terror. It reminds us that technological sophistication and cultural achievement do not necessarily correspond to humanitarian values, and that some of history's most advanced civilizations have also been capable of its greatest cruelties. Elephant execution of MAHOUTS. Early Gupta India. The golden age of ancient India was dawning as the 4th century of the Common Era began, and nowhere was this more evident than in the magnificent court of the Gupta emperors. These rulers, who would come to be remembered as patrons of art, literature, and learning, presided over an empire that stretched across much of northern India, from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. But beneath the glittering surface of this classical civilization lay darker currents, ancient traditions of justice and punishment that revealed the complex relationship between power, religion, and death in early Indian society. In the royal elephant stables of Pataliputra, the Gupta capital, Mahouts, the skilled trainers and handlers of war elephants, worked with creatures that were far more than mere animals. Elephants in ancient India were symbols of royal power, divine wisdom, and cosmic order. They were associated with Ganesha, the elephant-headed god who removed obstacles, and with Airavata, the white elephant that served as the mount of Indra, king of the gods. To serve as a Mahout was not merely a profession, but a sacred trust, one that carried both immense honor and terrible responsibility. The relationship between Mahout and elephant was unlike any other in the ancient world. These men spent their entire lives with their charges, learning every nuance of elephant behavior, every sound and movement that might indicate mood or intention. A skilled Mahout could make a war elephant kneel before an enemy, charge through enemy lines with devastating effect, or delicately place its foot to avoid stepping on fallen soldiers. The bond between man and beast was so close that elephants were known to mourn their Mahouts' deaths and refuse to work with replacements. But this intimate relationship, so essential to the elephant's role in warfare and ceremony, could also be turned to darker purposes. When a Mahout betrayed his trust, whether through cowardice in battle theft of royal property, or outright treason, the very creature he had trained and bonded with could become the instrument of his execution. The case that best illustrates this practice involved a mahout named Devadatta, a man who had served the Gupta court faithfully for over 2 decades. He was responsible for Kumudvati, a massive female elephant renowned for her intelligence and her perfectly coordinated movements during royal ceremonies. Devadatta had trained her from a calf, and their partnership had become legendary throughout the empire. Together, they had participated in dozens of military campaigns, religious festivals, and royal processions. But Devadatta's loyalty had a price, and that price had apparently been met by agents of the Sassanid Persian Empire, who were always seeking ways to undermine Gupta power. The Mahout was discovered passing information about Gupta military movements to Persian spies, intelligence that had already resulted in the ambush and destruction of a Gupta army column. His betrayal had cost hundreds of lives and had nearly resulted in the loss of an entire province. When Devadatta was brought before the emperor for judgment, the crime was seen as more than simple treason. In the Hindu conception of cosmic order, Dharma, his betrayal represented a fundamental violation of the natural hierarchy that kept the universe in balance. A mahout who betrayed his royal master was like a son who murdered his father, or a student who attacked his teacher. He had corrupted the sacred relationships that made civilization possible. The punishment decreed by the emperor was one that would restore balance through poetic justice. Devadatta would be executed by Kumudvati herself, the very elephant he had trained and loved. The method would demonstrate that even the animals recognized his guilt and rejected him, that the natural order itself was rising up to punish his transgression. The execution was scheduled to take place during a religious festival, when the court and people could witness the restoration of Dharma. The setting was the great courtyard of the royal palace, with the emperor seated on his throne and hundreds of nobles, priests, and commoners arranged in carefully ordered ranks, according to their status. This was not merely an execution, but a religious ceremony, a ritual restoration of cosmic balance. Kumudvati was brought into the courtyard decorated with the finest silk cloths and golden ornaments, as if she were participating in a religious procession rather than an execution. Her movements were slow and stately, her great head swaying gently from side to side in the characteristic manner of elephants. To the assembled crowd, she appeared to be a manifestation of divine justice itself, beautiful and terrible in her power. Devadatta was led into the courtyard, bound with silken cords rather than iron chains. Even in his final moments, his former status as a royal servant was acknowledged, but his face, according to contemporary accounts, showed the full horror of his situation. He knew Kumudvati's capabilities better than anyone. He had trained her to respond to specific commands, had taught her to place her feet with precision, had shown her how to use her strength in exactly the ways that would now be turned against him. The execution method varied, depending on the specific crime and the emperor's wishes. But in Devadatta's case, the chosen method was crushing. The mahout was made to lie on the ground before his elephant, and at a signal from the emperor, Kumudvati was commanded to place her foot on his chest. The elephant hesitated. Contemporary accounts suggest that she recognized her former master and was reluctant to harm him. But the commands were repeated, accompanied by the traditional goads and signals that Devadatta himself had taught her to obey. When Kumudvati finally obeyed, the crushing was not immediate. Elephants can control their weight with remarkable precision, and she began by applying just enough pressure to pin Devadatta to the ground, without immediately killing him. The pressure increased gradually, allowing the victim to experience the full horror of his situation, while giving the crowd time to contemplate the justice being enacted. The psychological effect on both victim and witnesses was carefully calculated. Devadatta could feel his ribs beginning to crack under the increasing pressure, could sense his breath becoming more and more labored, could see in Kumudvati's eyes the conflict between her natural affection for him and her trained obedience to command. The crowd could witness the mahout's terror and suffering, while also observing the elephant's apparent reluctance, which only emphasized the justice of the punishment. Even the animals recognized that this death was necessary. The final phase of the execution came when Kumudvati was commanded to apply her full weight. An adult female elephant weighs several tons, and the crushing effect was both immediate and complete. Devadatta's death was not quick, but it was inevitable. His ribs collapsed, his internal organs were compressed beyond survival, and within minutes the life had been crushed from his body. But the ceremony was not yet complete. In Hindu belief, the manner of death affected the soul's journey to its next incarnation. A traitor who died in shame and agony would carry that karma into future lives, facing punishment that extended beyond the boundaries of any single existence. The elephant execution thus served not only as earthly justice but as spiritual condemnation. The religious significance of using elephants for execution went deeper than simple symbolism. In Hindu cosmology, elephants were associated with memory and wisdom. They were said to remember everything they had experienced and to pass that knowledge on to their offspring. An elephant that had participated in an execution would carry the memory of that justice, serving as a living reminder of the consequences of betrayal. The training required to prepare elephants for execution duties was extensive and specialized. Not every elephant could be used for this purpose. The animals had to be intelligent enough to follow complex commands, disciplined enough to overcome their natural gentleness, and emotionally stable enough to perform under the intense pressure of public ceremony. The most prized execution elephants were those that showed apparent reluctance before obeying commands, as this suggested that even they recognized the gravity of the situation. The MAHOUTS who trained execution elephants occupied a unique position in Gupta society. They were both honored for their skill and feared for their knowledge of death. Many became wealthy from royal patronage, but they also lived under constant suspicion. After all, they possessed the knowledge to turn the kingdom's most powerful weapons against their masters. Some execution mahouts were themselves eventually executed, victims of the same suspicions and political machinations that had claimed their predecessors. The practice of elephant execution spread throughout the Indian subcontinent and into Southeast Asia. Wherever Hindu or Buddhist rulers maintained elephant core, each kingdom developed its own variations. Some preferred crushing, others used the elephant's tusks to impale victims. Still others trained elephants to dismember condemned prisoners with their trunks. The methods varied, but the underlying principle remained the same. The execution would demonstrate the natural order's rejection of the criminal's actions. The decline of elephant execution in India came gradually, influenced by changing religious sensibilities, rather than any sudden legal reform. Buddhism, with its emphasis on ahimsa or non-violence, began to influence Hindu rulers' attitudes toward capital punishment. The idea that even justified killing generated negative karma became more widespread, leading to the adoption of less elaborate execution methods or, in some cases, the commutation of death sentences to exile or imprisonment. The arrival of Islamic rule in northern India accelerated this change. Islamic law recognized fewer crimes as deserving death and generally prescribed quicker, less elaborate execution methods. The complex religious justifications for elephant execution did not translate easily into Islamic legal frameworks, and the practice gradually disappeared from most of the subcontinent, but elephant execution persisted in some regions well into the modern era. British colonial records from the 19th century describe witnessing such executions in various princely states, though by that time the practice was rare and usually reserved for the most heinous crimes. The last recorded elephant execution in India is believed to have taken place in 1947, just before independence, marking the end of a tradition that had persisted for over a millennium. The legacy of elephant execution in Indian culture extends beyond its use as a method of capital punishment. The practice became embedded in literature, art, and popular memory as a symbol of divine justice and royal power. Epic poems described heroes and villains meeting their ends beneath the feet of elephants. Temple carvings depicted the punishment of cosmic enemies in similar fashion. The image of the elephant as both creator and destroyer protector, and punisher became deeply rooted in Indian consciousness. The Chinese Buddhist pilgrim PHALARIS, who traveled through Gupta India in the early 5th century, left detailed accounts of elephant executions that he witnessed. His writings, preserved in Chinese monasteries and later translated into modern languages, provide some of our most detailed contemporary descriptions of the practice. PHALARIS was both fascinated and horrified by what he saw, noting the contrast between the Gupta rulers' patronage of Buddhist monasteries and their use of such violent punishments. These foreign accounts reveal how elephant execution was perceived by outsiders as a demonstration of both Indian civilization's sophistication and its capacity for refined cruelty. The training and coordination required impressed foreign observers, but the underlying brutality disturbed even those accustomed to violent public spectacles in their own cultures. The elephant execution tradition ultimately reflects the complex relationship between power, religion, and death in ancient Indian civilization. It shows us a society that could create magnificent art and literature, develop sophisticated philosophical systems, and build lasting religious institutions, while also devising elaborate methods for inflicting death. The Gupta age may have been golden in many ways, but its justice was often written in blood, administered by the very creatures that symbolized wisdom and divine protection. Skinning alive of SISAMNES, Persia, 5th c. BCE. The Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great and his successors was renowned throughout the ancient world for many things: its vast extent, stretching from India to Greece, its sophisticated administration, which allowed dozens of different peoples to coexist under Persian rule, its magnificent capitals at Persepolis and Susa, and its generally tolerant approach to local customs and religions. But Persia was also known for something far darker, a system of justice so severe, so deliberately terrifying, that even hardened warriors trembled at the thought of Persian punishment. This system reached perhaps its most horrific expression during the reign of Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, in the 6th century before Christ. Cambyses was a ruler of contradictions, capable of brilliant military strategy and efficient administration, but also prone to fits of rage and paranoia that could result in punishments of unimaginable cruelty. It was under his reign that one of history's most grotesquely memorable executions took place, one that would be recorded by Greek historians and remembered for millennia as the ultimate example of Persian justice. The victim was a man named SISAMNES, and his story begins not with any great crime or act of rebellion, but with something far more mundane and far more dangerous to the fabric of imperial administration: corruption. SISAMNES was a royal judge, one of the officials responsible for interpreting and enforcing Persian law throughout the empire. His position made him wealthy and powerful, but it also made him a target for those who sought to influence the legal system for their own benefit. The Persian legal system was theoretically based on the principle of absolute truth and justice, reflecting the Zoroastrian religious belief in the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. Judges were expected to be incorruptible servants of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, dispensing justice without fear or favor. In practice, of course, the system was as vulnerable to human weakness as any other, and wealthy litigants often sought to influence outcomes through bribery and intimidation. SISAMNES had apparently succumbed to these temptations. Contemporary accounts suggest that he had accepted substantial bribes to render favorable judgments in several important cases, perverting the course of justice and undermining the very foundations of Persian rule. When word of his corruption reached Cambyses, the king's reaction was swift and terrible. But Cambyses was not content simply to execute a corrupt judge and replace him with an honest one. The king understood that corruption was a cancer that could spread throughout the imperial administration if not dramatically checked. He needed to send a message that would be remembered not just by other judges, but by every official throughout the vast Persian Empire. The punishment would have to be so terrible, so memorable, that no one who heard of it would ever again consider betraying their oath of office. The method chosen was one that the Persians had developed into a refined art: the complete removal of a living person's skin. This was not a quick flaying that would result in rapid death from shock and blood loss, but a careful, methodical process designed to keep the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible, while systematically removing every inch of skin from their body. The execution was scheduled to take place in the great courtyard of the royal palace, before an audience of judges, administrators, and other court officials. The timing was carefully calculated. This was not to be a private act of royal vengeance, but a public lesson in the consequences of betraying the trust placed in royal servants. SISAMNES was brought before the king in chains, but he was allowed to speak in his own defense. Persian law, even in its most terrible applications, maintained certain forms and procedures. The accused could present his case, call witnesses, and appeal for royal mercy. But in SISAMNES's case, the evidence of corruption was overwhelming, and Cambyses had already made his decision. The judge's guilt was proclaimed publicly, his sentence announced, and the preparations for execution began. The flaying process began with SISAMNES being secured to a specially constructed frame that held him immobile, while allowing complete access to his body. The executioners were not common soldiers or prison guards, but skilled craftsmen who had been trained specifically for this purpose. Their knowledge of human anatomy was extensive. They knew exactly how deep to cut, to remove skin without immediately damaging vital organs, how to control bleeding to prevent the victim from dying too quickly, and how to maintain consciousness through the careful administration of stimulants. The skinning began at the extremities, fingers, and toes, where the skin could be removed in small sections without causing immediately fatal trauma. Each piece was carefully peeled away, revealing the raw flesh beneath. The pain was indescribable, but the victim remained conscious, held in place by his bonds, and kept alert by the adrenaline of extreme trauma. As the flaying continued, moving up the arms and legs toward the torso, SISAMNES would have experienced pain beyond the capacity of language to describe. The human nervous system, evolved to warn of damage through pain signals, was being overwhelmed by stimuli from every nerve ending simultaneously. Yet the executioner's skill kept him alive, kept him aware of every moment of his agony. The psychological torture was as carefully orchestrated as the physical. SISAMNES could see his own skin being methodically removed, could watch as the executioners displayed each section to the crowd before setting it aside. He could hear the reactions of the witnesses, gasps of horror, exclamations of disgust, the occasional sound of someone being physically sick. He knew that his suffering was serving as entertainment and instruction for hundreds of observers. The process continued for hours. Contemporary accounts suggest that SISAMNES remained conscious and aware until nearly the end, when shock and blood loss finally began to overwhelm his system. Even then, the executioners had methods for reviving victims who began to lose consciousness prematurely. Smelling salts, cold water, even primitive stimulants could be used to extend the ordeal. When death finally came, it was almost anticlimactic after the hours of methodical torture. But Cambyses was not finished with SISAMNES, even in death. In a gesture that would become one of the most infamous acts in the history of Persian justice, the king ordered that the judge's skin be tanned and prepared like leather. From this human leather, cushions would be made for the chair of SISAMNES's successor. This final indignity served multiple purposes in Cambyses's calculations. First, it ensured that the memory of SISAMNES's punishment would not fade with time. Every judge who sat in that chair would be physically reminded of what happened to those who betrayed their trust. Second, it demonstrated that even in death, traitors continued to serve the Persian state. Their very bodies became tools for maintaining justice. The appointment of SISAMNES's successor was itself part of the elaborate psychological theater that surrounded the execution. Cambyses chose Otanes, the dead judge's own son, to take his father's place. This choice was calculated to demonstrate both the extent of royal mercy — the son would not be punished for his father's crimes — and the completeness of royal justice. Otanes would sit upon cushions made from his father's skin, a daily reminder of the price of corruption. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century later, preserved the most detailed account of SISAMNES' execution that has come down to us. Herodotus was both fascinated and horrified by Persian methods of justice, seeing them as examples of both Eastern despotism and Eastern efficiency. His account of the flaying of SISAMNES became one of the most widely read passages in his histories, spreading knowledge of Persian cruelty throughout the Greek world. But Herodotus also recognized the effectiveness of such extreme punishments. He noted that corruption among Persian judges was remarkably rare, and that the empire's legal system functioned with an efficiency that Greek city-states could rarely match. The terror inspired by punishments like SISAMNES' execution created a level of administrative honesty that was difficult to achieve through other means. The influence of SISAMNES' story extended far beyond the Persian Empire. As Greek merchants, diplomats, and soldiers carried the tale throughout the Mediterranean world, it became a standard example of Eastern cruelty and despotism. Roman writers would later use similar stories to contrast their own, allegedly more humane system of justice with the barbarism of their Eastern enemies. But the story also influenced the development of Islamic legal traditions. When Arab conquerors encountered Persian administrative records centuries later, Islamic jurists studied Persian methods of punishment, sometimes adapting them to fit Islamic legal principles, sometimes explicitly rejecting them as contrary to the mercy that Islam demanded. The flaying of SISAMNES became a case study in the limits of earthly justice and the dangers of excessive punishment. The method of execution by flaying was not unique to Persia. Variations existed in many ancient cultures, from Assyria to Mesoamerica. But the Persians developed it to an unprecedented level of systematic cruelty, creating detailed protocols for different types of crimes and different degrees of suffering. They maintained records of executions, studied the most effective methods, and passed their knowledge down through generations of executioners. The psychological impact of such punishments extended far beyond their immediate victims. Every official throughout the Persian Empire knew the story of SISAMNES. Every judge who took office was aware that his chair might one day be cushioned with his own skin if he betrayed his trust. This knowledge created a climate of fear that was as effective as any system of surveillance or oversight. The end of systematic flaying as a form of execution came gradually, not through any single reform, but through the slow evolution of legal and religious thought. The conquests of Alexander the Great brought Greek ideas about justice and punishment into contact with Persian traditions, creating hybrid systems that were often less extreme than their Persian predecessors. Later, the rise of Christianity and Islam brought new concepts of divine mercy and human dignity that were difficult to reconcile with the most extreme forms of corporal punishment. While both religions recognized the necessity of earthly justice, they also emphasized the possibility of repentance and redemption, concepts that sat uneasily with punishments designed to inflict maximum suffering. The story of SISAMNES serves as a reminder of how far human institutions can go in their pursuit of order and control. The Persian Empire was one of history's great civilizations, capable of remarkable achievements in art, architecture, administration, and military organization. Yet it was also willing to inflict unimaginable suffering on individuals in service of what it saw as the greater good. The flaying of SISAMNES stands as one of history's most methodical approaches to state terror, a carefully calculated act of cruelty designed to maintain order through fear. It reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we might imagine, and that even the most sophisticated societies can justify the most terrible acts when they believe the stakes are high enough. Blood Eagle, legend. Reality. Viking Age. The cold North Sea wind whipped across the rocky shores of 9th century England as Viking longships appeared on the horizon like harbingers of doom. For the coastal monasteries and towns of Anglo-Saxon Britain, these dragon-prowed vessels brought terror that went beyond the fear of death or slavery. The Vikings had earned a reputation for cruelty that seemed to exceed even the brutal standards of the early medieval world, and no single practice contributed more to this fearsome reputation than the whispered stories of something called the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle occupies a unique place in the catalogue of human cruelty, part historical reality, part legendary exaggeration, part psychological warfare. The very name evokes images of ritualized savagery, of religious sacrifice taken to its most extreme conclusion. But separating fact from fiction in the case of the Blood Eagle requires us to navigate the complex world of Viking culture, where poetry and history intertwined, where saga and reality merged, and where the line between what actually happened and what should have happened often blurred. The earliest references to the Blood Eagle appear in the Icelandic sagas, those magnificent works of medieval literature that preserve the stories, myths, and historical memories of the Norse peoples. Written down centuries after the events they purport to describe, these sagas were part history, part entertainment, part cultural preservation. They tell us as much about how Vikings wanted to be remembered as about what they actually did. According to the sagas, the Blood Eagle was reserved for the most special victims, enemy kings, great warriors, those who had committed particularly heinous crimes against Viking honor. It was not a common form of execution, but rather a ritualized sacrifice that combined elements of religious worship, military honor, and calculated cruelty. The method, as described in the sagas, was as follows. The victim would be held face down while the executioner used a sharp axe or sword to hack through the ribs on either side of the spine. The rib cage would then be pried open like the wings of a bird, and the lungs would be pulled out and arranged over the victim's shoulders, creating the appearance of bloody wings. The most famous alleged victim of the Blood Eagle was King Ella of Northumbria, who had reportedly captured and executed the legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. When Ragnar's sons Ivar the Boneless, Ubbe, and Hvitserk invaded England in 865 to avenge their father's death, they supposedly performed the Blood Eagle on Ella as the ultimate expression of their revenge. But here, we encounter our first major historical problem. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our most reliable contemporary source for 9th century English history, makes no mention of the Blood Eagle in its account of Ella's death. It simply states that he was killed in battle with the Viking army. The Blood Eagle appears only in much later Icelandic sources, written by authors who were not present at the events and who had every incentive to embellish stories for dramatic effect. This pattern repeats itself throughout the historical record. Contemporary sources, Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Frankish annals, Irish monastic records describe Viking raids, battles, and conquests in considerable detail, but they rarely mention the specific torture methods that feature so prominently in later saga literature. This discrepancy has led modern historians to debate whether the Blood Eagle was ever actually performed, or whether it was purely a product of literary imagination. The archaeological evidence is equally ambiguous. While we have numerous Viking Age burial sites and battlefield excavations, we have found no skeletal remains that clearly show evidence of Blood Eagle execution. Rib bones that have been deliberately cut and arranged, lung tissue preserved in bog conditions, other physical traces of this distinctive method of killing all are absent from the archaeological record. Yet the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. The Blood Eagle, if it was performed, would have been reserved for very special occasions and very specific victims. The number of such executions might have been small enough that we would not expect to find clear archaeological traces. Moreover, many Viking Age burials involved cremation, which would destroy any evidence of the manner of death. The debate over the Blood Eagle's reality reveals something important about how we understand Viking culture. The Vikings were undoubtedly capable of extraordinary cruelty. Contemporary sources provide ample evidence of their willingness to kill, torture, and terrorize their enemies. But they were also sophisticated poets, traders, explorers, and lawmakers who created complex literary traditions and legal codes. The Blood Eagle might represent the intersection of these two aspects of Viking culture, the practical brutality and the poetic imagination. If the Blood Eagle was performed, It would have served multiple purposes within Viking society. First, it was clearly a religious ritual, a sacrifice to the Norse gods, particularly Odin, who was associated with death, war, and wisdom. Odin was said to have sacrificed himself by hanging from the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, in order to gain knowledge of the runes. The blood eagle might have been seen as a way of offering particularly important victims to Odin, in a manner that echoed his own self-sacrifice. Second, the blood eagle would have been a demonstration of honor and revenge. Viking culture placed enormous emphasis on the obligation to avenge wrongs done to one's family or followers. A man who died unavenged was dishonored, and his sons were obligated to seek retribution no matter how long it took or how dangerous it proved to be. The blood eagle represented revenge, taken to its ultimate conclusion. A punishment so elaborate and terrible that it would be talked about for generations. Third, the ritual served as psychological warfare. The Vikings were expert at using fear as a weapon, and stories of the blood eagle would have spread quickly among their enemies. The mere possibility that capture might result in such a death would have been enough to inspire terror and potentially to discourage resistance. In a world where warfare was often as much about intimidation as about actual fighting, the blood eagle was a powerful tool of psychological dominance. The technical aspects of performing a blood eagle would have required considerable anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. The executioner would have needed to know exactly where to cut to open the rib cage without immediately killing the victim, how to remove the lungs without causing immediate death from blood loss, and how to arrange the organs to create the desired visual effect. This level of expertise suggests either that the ritual was performed by individuals with specialized knowledge, perhaps priests or healers, or that it was not performed at all, existing only in the imagination of saga writers. The religious symbolism of the blood eagle was complex and multi-layered. The eagle was sacred to Odin, and eagles were believed to carry the souls of dead warriors to Valhalla. By transforming a victim into the semblance of an eagle, the executioners might have been symbolically offering that person's soul directly to Odin. The painful and prolonged nature of the death would have demonstrated the victim's courage or cowardice in the face of death, qualities that were extremely important in Viking concepts of honor. But the blood eagle also had darker connotations. In Norse mythology, eagles were associated with death and carrion, with the consumption of the dead. The great eagle that perched atop the world tree fed on corpses, and eagles were among the creatures that would survive Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. To die as a blood eagle might have been seen not just as an offering to Odin, but as a transformation into something monstrous, a punishment that extended beyond death into the mythological realm. The most detailed account of a blood eagle execution appears in the Orkneyinga saga, which describes the execution of Halfdan Longleg by Earl Torf Einar around 910 CE. According to the saga, Halfdan had killed Einar's father, and the Earl had sworn a terrible oath of revenge. When Halfdan was finally captured, Einar personally performed the blood eagle, cutting open Halfdan's back and pulling out his lungs while the victim was still alive. The saga emphasizes both the justice of this revenge and the horror of the method, creating a narrative that is both triumphant and disturbing. But even this relatively detailed account raises questions about historical accuracy. The Orkneyinga saga was written in the 13th century, 300 years after the events it describes. Its authors were working from oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of storytellers, each of whom might have embellished or altered the tale. The saga's emphasis on the elaborate nature of Halfdan's death might reflect more about 13th century literary tastes than about 10th century historical reality. Modern scholars have approached the blood eagle question from multiple angles. Some argue that the ritual was purely literary, a creation of saga writers who wanted to emphasize the terrible nature of their hero's revenge. Others suggest that while the specific details might be embellished, the basic practice existed and was occasionally performed on special victims. Still others propose that the blood eagle might have been a post-mortem ritual, performed on corpses rather than living victims, which would explain the absence of archaeological evidence while still allowing for some historical basis to the stories. The linguistic evidence is also ambiguous. The Old Norse terms used to describe the blood eagle blóðurinn and ristabaki blóðurinn could be interpreted in multiple ways. Some scholars argue that these phrases might have referred to different practices entirely, such as carving runic symbols on victims' backs or performing other forms of ritualized execution that were later misunderstood or deliberately exaggerated by saga writers. The blood eagle controversy highlights the broader challenges of understanding Viking Age culture through medieval literary sources. The sagas are magnificent works of literature, but they were written by Christian authors living in a very different world from the pagan Vikings they described. These writers might have emphasized the most extreme aspects of pre-Christian culture to demonstrate the superiority of the new faith, or they might have romanticized Viking brutality for entertainment purposes. The truth about the blood eagle may ultimately be unknowable. Whether it was a genuine religious ritual, a literary invention, or something in between, it has become inseparable from our image of Viking culture. The very debate over its existence tells us something important about how historical memory works, how stories can become more real than reality itself, and how the fear of extreme punishment can be as powerful as the punishment itself. What we can say with confidence is that the blood eagle, real or imagined, served important functions within Viking culture and continues to fascinate us today. It represents the intersection of honor and horror, of religious devotion and calculated cruelty that characterized much of medieval warfare. Whether Ella of Northumbria actually died with his lungs arranged like bloody wings, or whether he simply fell in battle like any other king, the story of the blood eagle has achieved a kind of immortality that transcends historical fact. In the end, perhaps the most important truth about the blood eagle is not whether it actually happened, but what its story tells us about human nature, about our capacity for both cruelty and creativity, about the ways in which fear and honor, religion and violence, poetry and history can become inextricably intertwined in the human imagination. Keelhauling in the Dutch Navy 17th Sea. The golden age of Dutch maritime power reached its zenith in the 17th century, when the ships of the United Provinces carried their distinctive orange, white, and blue flags to every corner of the known world. Dutch merchants traded in the Spice Islands of Indonesia, established colonies at the southern tip of Africa, and competed with the great powers of Europe for control of the world's sea lanes. But maintaining discipline aboard these vessels, often at sea for months or years at a time, required methods of punishment that matched the harsh realities of life on the ocean. And no punishment in the Dutch naval arsenal was more feared than keelhauling. The practice of keelhauling, dragging a sailor underwater along the length of a ship's keel, represented the intersection of maritime necessity and human cruelty. It was born from the unique challenges of maintaining order in the confined, dangerous world of a sailing ship, where a single act of disobedience could doom an entire crew and where traditional forms of punishment often proved inadequate to the special conditions of life at sea. To understand keelhauling, we must first understand the world that created it. A Dutch East Indies Company ship in the 17th century was a complex ecosystem of competing interests and hierarchies. The crew might number several hundred men, drawn from dozens of different nations and social backgrounds. Dutch sailors served alongside Germans, Scandinavians, Portuguese, and even captured pirates who had accepted service rather than execution. Officers were typically Dutch and Protestant, but the common sailors might follow any religion or none at all. These men lived in conditions that would be considered intolerable today. They were packed into spaces barely large enough to lie down, with poor food, contaminated water, and no privacy. Disease was rampant, accidents were frequent, and death was a constant companion. The ship itself was their prison, their workplace, and their only hope of survival, all at once. In such an environment, traditional concepts of law and punishment had to be adapted to maritime realities The Dutch Naval Code, developed over generations of seafaring experience, recognized that different crimes required different punishments. Minor infractions, laziness, drunkenness, petty theft, might result in reduced rations, extra duties, or flogging. More serious crimes, insubordination, desertion, striking an officer called for increasingly severe penalties. But the most serious maritime crimes, mutiny, cowardice in battle, repeated desertion, demanded punishments that would serve as unmistakable warnings to the rest of the crew. Keelhauling was reserved for these most serious offences, and for sailors who had proven themselves incorrigible despite lesser punishments. The procedure was as follows. The condemned sailor would be stripped and have his hands and feet bound with rope. A longer rope would be tied around his waist and threaded under the ship's hull from one side to the other. The victim would then be thrown overboard from the port side, dragged underwater along the entire length of the ship's keel, and hauled up on the starboard side. The horror of this punishment lay not just in the immediate physical trauma, but in its multiple layers of suffering. The condemned man would first experience the shock of being thrown into the ocean, often while the ship was underway. The cold North Atlantic or Baltic waters could induce immediate shock and hypothermia. Then came the terror of being dragged underwater, unable to breathe, fighting against his bonds while being pulled through the dark water beneath the ship. But the worst was yet to come. The keel of a 17th century sailing ship was not a smooth surface, but a rough, barnacle-encrusted ridge that projected several feet below the hull. These barnacles, accumulated during months at sea, formed a razor-sharp coating that could shred flesh from bone. As the victim was dragged along this surface, his back, shoulders, and limbs would be scraped raw by thousands of tiny, jagged shells. The speed of the dragging determined whether the punishment would be merely excruciating or immediately fatal. If the ship was moving quickly, the victim might be pulled through the water so fast that the barnacles would strip away not just skin but muscle and even bone. Death would come quickly from blood loss or drowning. But if the ship was moving slowly, or if it was stationary, the keel hauling could be extended, allowing the victim to surface gasping for air before being dragged under again for another passage along the keel. The most detailed account of keel hauling that has survived comes from the journal of a Dutch ship's surgeon named Isbrand van der Meer, who served aboard East India Company vessels in the 1670s and 1680s. Van der Meer witnessed several keel haulings during his career and recorded both the medical details of the punishment and its effects on ship morale and discipline. In one particularly vivid account, Van der Meer describes the keel hauling of a sailor named Johannes Verkerk, who had been caught stealing from the ship's medical supplies, a crime considered especially serious because it endangered the health of the entire crew. Verkerk had already been flogged twice for similar offences, and Captain Pieter van Hoorn decided that only the most severe punishment would deter others from following his example. The keel hauling was scheduled for dawn, when the entire crew could be assembled on deck to witness the punishment. Verkerk was brought up from the ship's hold, where he had been confined. His hands already bound behind his back, he was given the opportunity to speak, according to Dutch naval custom, but chose to remain silent. Van der Meer noted that the man's face was pale but composed. He understood what was about to happen and had apparently accepted his fate. The ship's boatswain, a grizzled veteran named Klaas de Wit, supervised the preparation. Extra rope was secured around Verkerk's waist, and weights were attached to his feet to ensure that he would be dragged close against the keel rather than floating freely in the water. The rope was then threaded under the ship from port to starboard, a process that required several men in a small boat to guide it around the ship's hull. When all was ready, Captain Van Hoorn gave the signal, and Verkerk was pushed overboard. Van der Meer noted that the man did not cry out, even as he hit the cold water. The crew on the starboard side began hauling on the rope, pulling the victim underwater and along the keel. The process took nearly 5 minutes, an eternity for a man trying to hold his breath while being scraped against barnacles. When Verkerk was finally hauled up on the starboard side, Vandermeer was shocked by the transformation. The man who had gone overboard, fully clothed and intact, emerged as a barely recognizable mass of torn flesh and flowing blood. His back was scraped down to the ribs in several places, his arms and legs were shredded, and his face was so swollen from near drowning that his features were almost unrecognizable. Amazingly, Verkerk was still alive, though barely conscious. Vandermeer immediately went to work trying to save him, cleaning and binding his wounds, administering what primitive medical care was available. But the damage was too extensive. Verkerk lingered for 3 days, conscious enough to experience every moment of his agony, before finally dying from a combination of blood loss, infection, and internal injuries. The psychological effect of Verkerk's keelhauling on the rest of the crew was exactly what Captain Van Hoorn had intended. The theft of medical supplies ceased immediately, and overall discipline aboard the ship improved markedly. But Vandermeer noted that the crew's attitude toward their officers also changed, becoming more fearful and sullen. The captain had demonstrated his power to inflict terrible punishment, but he had also created an atmosphere of terror that affected every aspect of shipboard life. The technical aspects of keel hauling varied depending on the size and type of ship, the speed at which it was traveling, and the specific crime being punished. Larger ships with deeper keels would cause more damage, while smaller vessels might result in punishment that was severe, but not necessarily fatal. The season also mattered. Keel hauling in the warm waters of the Indies was less likely to cause death from hypothermia than the same punishment in the cold North Sea. Some captains developed variations on the standard procedure to adjust the severity of the punishment. Dry keel hauling involved dragging the victim along the keel while the ship was in port, reducing the risk of drowning but still subjecting him to the tearing effects of the barnacles. Others practiced half keel hauling, where the victim was dragged only partway along the keel before being hauled up, allowing for repeated punishment of the same individual. The legal status of keel hauling within Dutch naval law was complex and evolved over time. Initially, it was considered a traditional punishment that captains could impose at their discretion, part of the broad authority granted to ship commanders who might be months away from any higher authority. But as the Dutch maritime empire grew and became more bureaucratized, there was increasing pressure to codify and regulate even the most severe punishments. By the late 17th century, Dutch naval regulations required that keel hauling be approved by a council of the ship's officers, rather than ordered by the captain alone. The crime had to be serious enough to warrant such extreme punishment, and the evidence of guilt had to be clear and convincing. These reforms were intended to prevent the arbitrary use of keel hauling for personal revenge or to maintain discipline through terror. But the reforms also reflected changing attitudes toward punishment in Dutch society more broadly. The Netherlands in the 17th century was experiencing a flowering of humanistic thought, influenced by philosophers like Hugo Grotius and legal scholars who were beginning to question the ethical foundations of extreme punishment. The Dutch Republic's prosperity and stability allowed for the luxury of moral reflection that was not always possible in less secure societies. The decline of keel hauling began in the early 18th century and was driven by several factors. The growth of professional naval academies meant that officers were better trained in alternative methods of maintaining discipline. The influence of Enlightenment thought created intellectual pressure for more humane treatment of sailors, and the practical experience of naval commanders suggested that extreme punishments like keel hauling were often counterproductive, creating resentment and fear rather than genuine discipline. The East India Company, always concerned with the practical efficiency of its operations, began to study the relationship between punishment practices and crew performance. Their records suggest that ships with captains who relied heavily on extreme punishments experienced higher rates of desertion, mutiny, and medical problems. Sailors who survived keel hauling were often too disabled to perform their duties effectively, representing a net loss to the ship's operational capacity. International pressure also played a role in the decline of keel hauling. As European naval powers began to develop more standardized codes of maritime law, Practices that were seen as excessively cruel became diplomatic embarrassments. Dutch ships operating in foreign ports might face criticism or even legal challenges if their punishment practices were deemed too severe by local authorities. The final abolition of keel hauling in the Dutch Navy came in 1853 as part of a comprehensive reform of military justice that reflected 19th century humanitarian sensibilities. By that time, the practice had already become rare, surviving mainly in the most remote trading posts, where traditional naval culture persisted longest. But the legacy of keel hauling extended far beyond its use as a naval punishment. The practice became embedded in maritime culture and language, giving rise to expressions and stories that survived long after the punishment itself had been abandoned. Going under the keel became a euphemism for any severe trial or punishment, while tales of sailors who survived keel hauling became part of the folklore of the sea. The historical record of keel hauling also provides valuable insights into the development of human rights concepts and the evolution of military justice. The debates within Dutch naval circles about the ethics and effectiveness of extreme punishment prefigured later international discussions about the treatment of prisoners and the limits of military authority. Modern maritime historians have used records of keel hauling to study broader patterns of social control and cultural change in early modern Europe. The practice represents a fascinating intersection of practical necessity, cultural tradition, and evolving moral sensibilities. It shows us a world where individual human lives were considered expendable in service of larger goals, but also a world that was beginning to question whether such expendability was truly necessary. The Dutch experience with keel hauling ultimately became a case study in how societies adapt their most extreme practices to changing circumstances and values. The punishment that had once seemed essential to maintaining order at sea came to be seen as barbaric and counterproductive. The same pragmatic spirit that had initially justified keel hauling eventually led to its abandonment in favor of more humane and effective methods of naval discipline. Breaking on the wheel, France. 18th. The cobblestones of Paris gleamed wetly in the grey light of a March morning in 1757, and crowds were already gathering despite the early hour. Word had spread through the city's taverns, markets, and coffee houses that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would be talked about for decades to come. Today, the most severe punishment in French law was to be carried out in the Place de Grève, and the victim was no ordinary criminal, but a man whose crime had shaken the foundations of the monarchy itself. Robert François Damiens had committed the ultimate transgression against the sacred person of Louis XV. On a cold January evening, as the king left the Palace of Versailles for his carriage, Damiens had approached with what appeared to be a petition, but instead of falling to his knees as protocol demanded, he had struck at the king with a small penknife, inflicting a shallow but shocking wound. The cut was barely an inch deep, hardly life-threatening, but it represented something far more dangerous than physical harm. It was an attack on the divine order that placed the king at the apex of French society. In the absolutist France of Louis XV, the king was not merely a political leader, but the earthly representative of God's will. His person was sacred, his authority absolute, his safety essential to the welfare of the realm. An attack on the king was not just treason but sacrilege, a crime that threatened the very foundations of civilization. Such an offense demanded a punishment that would demonstrate both the gravity of the crime and the terrible power of royal justice. The punishment prescribed by French law for regicide, or in Damiens' case, attempted regicide, was breaking on the wheel, known in French as la roue. This was not simply an execution, but an elaborate ritual of suffering designed to match the enormity of the crime with the extremity of the punishment. The condemned would be stretched on a wooden frame, their limbs systematically broken with an iron bar, and then left to die slowly on a cartwheel elevated above the crowd. The legal process that led to Damiens' condemnation had been thorough and terrifying. He had been tortured repeatedly to discover his accomplices and motivations, subjected to the water torture, where enormous quantities of liquid were forced down his throat and questioned by teams of judges, prosecutors, and theologians. But Damiens had maintained throughout his ordeal that he had acted alone, driven by religious mania and a confused desire to force the king to change his policies toward the church. The preparations for the execution had been elaborate and expensive. Special scaffolding was erected in the Place de Grève to ensure good visibility for the expected crowds. The wheel itself was constructed according to ancient specifications, a wooden cartwheel bound with iron and designed to be raised on a post so that the victim's agony would be visible from a great distance. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, had supervised every detail with the professional expertise of a family that had served as royal executioners for generations. The crowd that gathered that March morning represented every level of Parisian society. Nobles in their carriages occupied the best viewing positions, while merchants, craftsmen, and laborers pressed forward for closer looks. Women held children on their shoulders, vendors sold refreshments, and pickpockets worked the crowd. This was not merely an execution, but a public festival, a communal experience that would bind the spectators together in witnessing the triumph of justice over crime. Damiens was brought to the scaffold in a cart, wearing only a shirt and looking far older than his 42 years. The months of imprisonment and torture had taken their toll. His hair had turned white, his face was gaunt, and his body bore the marks of the interrogations he had endured. But he seemed alert and aware, responding to the priest's final ministrations and speaking briefly to the assembled officials. The execution began with the ritual reading of the sentence, a formal document that detailed not only Damiens' crime, but the symbolic meaning of his punishment. He was to have his right hand burned off with sulfur for holding the knife that had struck the king. His arms, legs, chest, and thighs were to be torn with red-hot pincers. Molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, and sulfur were to be poured into the wounds. Then his limbs were to be pulled off by horses, and his remains burned to ashes. The actual execution proved far more difficult and prolonged than anyone had anticipated. The burning of Damiens' hand proceeded as planned, the sulfur igniting with a blue flame that sent up clouds of acrid smoke. But the convicted man seemed to possess an extraordinary resistance to pain and injury. When the red-hot pincers tore at his flesh, he screamed but did not lose consciousness. When the molten substances were poured into the wounds, he writhed in agony but continued to breathe and speak. The most horrific part of the execution was yet to come. 4 powerful horses were hitched to ropes attached to Damiens' arms and legs, and at a signal from the executioner, they were driven in opposite directions. The goal was to literally tear the condemned man apart, to demonstrate the power of royal justice by utterly destroying the body that had dared to strike at the king. But human joints and sinews proved more resilient than expected. For over an hour, the horses pulled and strained while Damiens remained intact, his body stretched to impossible dimensions but refusing to separate. The crowd grew restless, then horrified. As the execution dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated, some spectators began to leave, unable to watch the prolonged agony. Executioner Sanson was forced to improvise. He ordered that the ropes be retied and the horses repositioned. When this failed to achieve the desired result, he used his knife to partially sever the tendons and ligaments at the major joints, weakening them enough that the horses could complete their grim work. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of pulling, Damiens' body came apart, his limbs separating from his torso in a shower of blood. Even then, witnesses reported that Damiens remained conscious, his torso still moving and his lips still forming words, though no sound emerged. It was only when his remains were thrown onto the prepared fire that life finally left his body. The burning continued for hours, until nothing remained but ash that was scattered to the winds. The execution of Damiens represented the absolute extreme of French royal justice, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it shocked even those accustomed to public violence. Contemporary accounts describe spectators weeping, fainting, and vomiting at the sight of such prolonged agony. The execution had achieved its goal of demonstrating royal power, but it had also revealed something disturbing about the nature of that power. The method of breaking on the wheel, while less elaborate than Damien's punishment, was itself a carefully calibrated form of torture. The condemned would be stretched on a wooden frame called a St. Andrew's cross, their limbs positioned so that they lay across gaps in the wood. The executioner would then use a heavy iron bar to systematically break the bones, 2 blows to each arm, 2 to each leg, and finally a blow to the chest or stomach that was usually fatal. The skill required to perform this punishment properly was considerable. The executioner had to break the bones cleanly without immediately killing the victim, and had to judge exactly how much damage could be inflicted while keeping the condemned conscious and aware. Too light a blow would fail to break the bone properly, while too heavy a blow might cause immediate death and rob the punishment of its deterrent effect. After the breaking was complete, the victim's shattered limbs would be woven through the spokes of a large cartwheel, creating a grotesque human sculpture that would be elevated on a post for public display. Death would come slowly from shock, blood loss, and exposure, sometimes taking days to arrive. The body would be left on the wheel until it decomposed completely, serving as a long-term warning to potential criminals. The wheel punishment was typically reserved for the most serious crimes: murder, highway robbery, arson, and treason. French law recognized gradations of guilt that corresponded to different degrees of suffering. A simple murderer might be granted the mercy stroke, a final blow to the chest that would bring quick death after the breaking, but those guilty of particularly heinous crimes, like Damien's, would be denied this mercy and left to die slowly. The social and religious dimensions of wheel punishment were as important as its physical aspects. The public nature of the execution served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the power of royal justice. It provided a warning to potential criminals, and it allowed the community to participate in the restoration of moral order. The crowd's presence was not incidental, but essential without witnesses. The punishment lost much of its meaning. The religious elements were equally complex. Catholic theology taught that suffering in this world might reduce punishment in the next, and some condemned criminals were encouraged to see their agony as a form of purification. Priests would attend the execution, offering final rites and urging the victim to use their pain as an opportunity for redemption. The crowd would often pray for the condemned, creating a strange mixture of cruelty and compassion. The Damien's execution marked a turning point in French attitudes toward public punishment. The excessive cruelty and the prolonged nature of his death disgusted many witnesses and contributed to growing criticism of traditional methods of criminal justice. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria used the Damien's case as an example of the barbarism they sought to reform. The influence of Enlightenment thinking gradually transformed French criminal law over the course of the 18th century. Reformers argued that punishment should be proportionate to crime, that the goal of justice should be deterrence rather than revenge, and that excessive cruelty was both morally wrong and practically counterproductive. These ideas gained influence among educated elites and eventually began to affect legal practice. The wheel punishment was gradually abandoned in most of France during the later 18th century, replaced by quicker methods of execution that were seen as more humane. The guillotine, introduced during the French Revolution, represented the complete triumph of Enlightenment principles over traditional practices. It was quick, efficient, and supposedly painless, treating all criminals equally, regardless of their social status or the nature of their crimes. But the memory of the wheel lingered in French culture long after the practice had ended. The expression roué, meaning a dissolute person, derives from the wheel punishment and originally referred to someone who deserved to be broken on the wheel. The Place de Grève, where so many executions had taken place, was eventually renamed Place de l'Hôtel de Ville in an attempt to escape its grim associations. The transformation of French criminal justice in the 18th century reflects broader changes in European society and thought. The same period that saw the abolition of wheel punishment also witnessed the rise of modern concepts of human rights, the development of more systematic approaches to criminal law, and the beginning of prison reform movements that would reshape the entire criminal justice system. The story of breaking on the wheel, and particularly the execution of Robert Francois Damiens, serves as a powerful reminder of how far society has traveled in its understanding of justice and human dignity. What once seemed necessary and appropriate, the public torture of criminals as a demonstration of royal power and divine justice, came to be seen as barbaric and counterproductive. Yet the wheel punishment also reveals the complex relationships between law, religion, politics, and popular culture in pre-modern societies. It was not simply cruelty for its own sake, but a carefully constructed ritual that served multiple social functions and reflected deeply held beliefs about crime, punishment, and the nature of social order. Understanding this context does not excuse the barbarity of the practice, but it helps us comprehend the worldview that made such punishments seem not only acceptable but necessary. The end of wheel punishment in France represents more than just the abolition of a particularly cruel form of execution. It marks the transition from a medieval understanding of justice based on hierarchy, ceremony, and divine sanction to a modern understanding based on equality, efficiency, and human rights. In many ways, the last turns of the wheel in 18th century France helped propel European society into the modern age. Drawn, hanged, quartered England, 1606. The early morning fog hung thick over London as January 31st, 1606, dawned cold and grey. In the Tower of London, a man who had become the most infamous prisoner in England prepared for what would be his final journey through the streets of the city. Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, as he preferred to be known, had spent months in the Tower's most secure cells, enduring interrogation and torture, as the authorities sought to uncover every detail of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed Parliament and killed the king. The Gunpowder Plot, as it had come to be known, represented the most audacious act of terrorism in English history. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and including the now infamous Fawkes, had planned to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament on November 5, 1605. Their goal was nothing less than the complete destruction of England's Protestant government. They intended to kill King James I, his family, and virtually the entire political establishment in a single massive explosion. The plot had failed, discovered when Fawkes was found in the cellars beneath Parliament, with 36 barrels of gunpowder and the means to ignite them. His capture had set off a massive manhunt that eventually rounded up most of the conspirators, leading to trials that had transfixed the nation. The government needed to make an example of these men that would discourage any future Catholic plots against the Protestant state. For crimes of this magnitude, high treason against the Crown English law prescribed a punishment that was designed to be as terrifying as it was final. The sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was not merely an execution, but a ritualized destruction of the traitor's body, a process so elaborate and horrible that its very description was meant to deter others from following the same path. The full sentence, as pronounced by the court, was a masterpiece of legal sadism. The condemned would be drawn through the streets on a hurdle to the place of execution, hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive, disemboweled and his entrails burned before his eyes, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 quarters. Each element of this punishment carried symbolic meaning, transforming the execution into a ritual drama about the nature of treason and the power of royal justice. Fawkes had endured months of interrogation since his capture, including torture on the rack that had left him barely able to walk. The government had been determined to extract every possible detail about the conspiracy, to identify every sympathizer and co-conspirator. The use of torture in such cases was controversial, even by the standards of the early 17th century, but the magnitude of the plot seemed to justify extreme measures. The journey to the place of execution began at the tower, where Fawkes was loaded onto a wooden hurdle, essentially a sledge that would drag him through the cobblestone streets of London. This drawing was itself part of the punishment, designed to humiliate the condemned, while allowing the largest possible number of people to witness his fate. The route from the tower to the execution site at Old Palace Yard, Westminster, was deliberately chosen to pass through the most densely populated areas of the city. The crowds that lined the streets represented every level of English society. Nobles watched from their carriages, and the windows of grand houses, merchants and craftsmen pressed forward for better views, and the poor fought for positions along the route. This was not merely public entertainment, but a national ritual, a collective affirmation of Protestant England's triumph over Catholic conspiracy. The mood of the crowd was complex and volatile. There was certainly anger toward Fawkes and his fellow conspirators. They had come within hours of destroying Parliament and murdering the king. But there was also a kind of fascination with the man who had dared such an audacious plot. Fawkes himself had become a figure of grudging admiration even among his enemies. His courage under torture, his refusal to reveal his accomplices until broken by extreme suffering, and his unwavering commitment to his cause had earned him a reputation for bravery that complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil. At the execution site, elaborate preparations had been made to ensure that the punishment would achieve maximum impact. A scaffold had been erected to provide good visibility, with the gallows, block, and fire all positioned so that the crowd could witness every detail of the proceedings. The executioner and his assistants had prepared their tools with professional precision: the rope for hanging, the knife for disemboweling, the axe for quartering, and the fire for burning the entrails. The hanging phase of the execution was carefully calculated to be non-fatal. Fawkes would be suspended by the neck just long enough to experience the terror of strangulation without losing consciousness completely. This required considerable skill from the executioner, who had to judge precisely how long the victim could hang before permanent damage occurred. The goal was to bring the condemned to the very edge of death without crossing over. When Fawkes was cut down from the gallows, still alive but weakened by partial strangulation, he would have been fully aware of what was about to happen. The disemboweling was perhaps the most horrific part of the entire process. The executioner would cut open the victim's abdomen and remove the intestines, liver, and other organs, while the condemned remained conscious. These organs would then be thrown into the fire that had been prepared nearby, creating smoke and the terrible smell of burning flesh. The symbolism of this phase was particularly important in cases of treason. The intestines were considered the seat of treasonous thoughts and feelings, so their removal and burning represented the purification of the body politic from corrupt influences. The condemned was forced to watch this destruction of his own body, experiencing both physical agony and the psychological horror of witnessing his own dismemberment. Contemporary accounts suggest that this phase of Fawkes's execution proceeded according to plan, with the victim remaining conscious long enough to see his own entrails burning in the fire. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Even those who supported the punishment found the reality of it difficult to watch. Some spectators reportedly fainted or became physically ill, while others pressed forward for a better view. The beheading that followed was almost merciful by comparison, bringing an end to the victim's suffering. But even this was carried out with ceremony and symbolism. The head would be held up for the crowd to see, with the executioner crying out, "Behold the head of a traitor." This display served to confirm that justice had been done and that the threat posed by the condemned had been permanently eliminated. The final phase, the quartering, was performed on the corpse, but it carried its own symbolic weight. The 4 parts of the body would be displayed in different locations around London and the kingdom, serving as long-term reminders of the fate that awaited traitors. Fawkes's head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, joining the collection of traitors' heads that had adorned that structure for centuries. But the execution of Guy Fawkes was only one part of a larger ritual of state justice. 7 other conspirators were executed alongside him over the course of 2 days, each receiving the same terrible punishment. The government wanted to ensure that the message was unmistakable. This was what happened to those who plotted against the Protestant state and the person of the king. The legal and religious justifications for such extreme punishment were complex and reflected the intersection of secular and spiritual authority in early 17th century England. Treason was not merely a crime against the state, but a sin against God, who had placed the king in his position of authority. The elaborate nature of the punishment was therefore justified as matching the enormity of both the temporal and spiritual offense. The Church of England officially supported the use of such punishments for traitors, arguing that earthly suffering might reduce punishment in the afterlife, and that the public nature of the execution served as a warning to others who might be tempted towards similar crimes. Priests attended the executions, offering final rites and urging the condemned to use their suffering as an opportunity for repentance and redemption. The international dimension of the gunpowder plot executions was also significant. Catholic Europe watched carefully to see how Protestant England would respond to the conspiracy, and the extreme nature of the punishments was intended to send a clear message about English resolve. Foreign ambassadors attended the executions and reported back to their governments about English methods of dealing with religious and political dissent. The psychological impact of hanging, drawing, and quartering extended far beyond its immediate victims. The very existence of such a punishment created an atmosphere of terror that affected all potential opponents of the regime. Catholic recusants, political dissidents, and anyone who might harbor treasonous thoughts lived with the knowledge that discovery could result in the most agonizing death imaginable. The detailed description of the punishment was itself a form of psychological warfare. Legal documents, popular pamphlets, and word-of-mouth accounts spread throughout the kingdom, ensuring that everyone understood exactly what hanging, drawing, and quartering entailed. The government wanted people to know not just that treason would be punished, but how it would be punished. The efficiency of the English legal system in processing the gunpowder plot conspirators was remarkable by the standards of the time. Within months of the discovery of the plot, most of the conspirators had been captured, tried, and executed. This speed was itself part of the deterrent effect. Potential traitors could see that English justice was swift as well as terrible. The popular memory of the gunpowder plot and its aftermath was carefully cultivated by the government. November 5th was declared a national holiday, with bonfires and celebrations marking the discovery and failure of the Catholic conspiracy. The execution of Guy Fawkes became part of this annual ritual, with effigies of the conspirator burned throughout England in commemoration of their defeat. The phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered entered popular English usage as a synonym for the most extreme punishment, even after the practice itself had been abandoned. The words carried connotations of ultimate justice, complete destruction, and the power of the state to exact terrible revenge on its enemies. Even today, the phrase resonates in English-speaking cultures as a symbol of extreme retribution. The legal precedent established by the gunpowder plot trials and executions influenced English law for centuries. The definition of treason was refined and expanded. The procedures for investigating conspiracies were systematized, and the use of torture in cases of national security was given legal justification. These precedents would be invoked repeatedly in later cases involving threats to state security. The decline of hanging, drawing, and quartering as a form of punishment came gradually, driven by changing attitudes toward public suffering and evolving concepts of human dignity. The last full execution of this type in England occurred in 1782, though the sentence continued to be pronounced for treason cases well into the 19th century. By that time, it was customary to hang the victim until dead before carrying out the other elements of the sentence, transforming it from prolonged torture into symbolic ritual. The abolition of this punishment reflected broader changes in English society and law. The influence of Enlightenment thinking, the growth of humanitarian sentiment, and practical concerns about public order all contributed to the gradual elimination of the most extreme forms of capital punishment. The same period saw reforms in prison conditions, the development of more systematic approaches to criminal law, and the beginning of movements that would eventually lead to the complete abolition of capital punishment. The story of Guy Fawkes and his terrible end serves as a powerful reminder of the intersection between religious conflict, political power, and criminal justice in early modern England. His execution was not simply the punishment of a criminal, but the culmination of a national trauma, a ritual of healing that sought to restore order after a crisis that had threatened the very foundations of the English state. Yet the legacy of the gunpowder plot and its aftermath is complex and ambiguous. Fawkes himself became a folk hero to some, a symbol of resistance to oppression and religious persecution. The annual Guy Fawkes Night celebrations evolved from government-sponsored anti-Catholic demonstrations into more general celebrations of rebellion and nonconformity. The man who died so horribly in 1606 became, paradoxically, a symbol of the very kind of dissent that his execution was meant to discourage. The transformation of Guy Fawkes from terrorist to folk hero reflects something profound about the nature of historical memory and the unpredictable ways in which extreme punishment can backfire. The government's attempt to create a lasting symbol of the futility of resistance instead created a lasting symbol of the courage required to challenge authority, regardless of the consequences. Impalement of VLAD, ČEPEŠ's foes. Wallachia, 1460s. The morning mist rose from the Danube River as it wound its way through the forests and plains of 15th-century Wallachia, that buffer principality caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Christian kingdoms of Europe. In this land of constant warfare and shifting allegiances, where survival often depended on one's ability to inspire terror in enemies and allies alike, there ruled a prince whose methods of dealing with opposition would become legendary throughout Europe and beyond. VLAD III, known to his contemporaries as VLAD ČEPEŠ. VLAD the Impaler transformed the ancient practice of impalement into an art form of psychological warfare that would echo through the centuries. Wallachia in the 1460s was a principality under constant threat. The Ottoman Empire pressed from the south, seeking to expand its control over the Balkans and establish a clear path toward the heart of Europe. Hungarian and Polish forces threatened from the north and west, pursuing their own territorial ambitions. Within the principality itself, rival boyar families plotted constantly against whatever prince managed to hold power, and the common people lived in fear of raiders, tax collectors, and the arbitrary justice of their feudal superiors. VLAD had come to power in this chaotic environment through a combination of Ottoman support, personal ambition, and sheer ruthlessness. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage at the Ottoman court, where he had learned not only the Turkish language and Islamic customs, but also the methods by which the sultans maintained order in their vast and diverse empire. The Ottomans were masters of calculated cruelty, using terror as a tool of statecraft to discourage rebellion and ensure submission. But VLAD would surpass even his Ottoman teachers in his systematic use of extreme punishment. His preferred method, impalement, was not unique to Wallachia, but he developed it into something approaching a science, with variations designed to achieve different psychological and practical effects, depending on the victim and the message he wished to send. The technique of impalement, as perfected by VLAD, involved driving a wooden stake through the victim's body in such a way as to cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediate death. The stakes were carefully prepared, sharpened to a point, but not too sharp, as a very sharp stake might cause too much damage and lead to quick death from blood loss. The diameter was also important. Too thick, and the stake would cause fatal trauma immediately. Too thin, and it might not support the victim's weight. The most common method involved inserting the stake through the rectum and driving it upward through the body cavity, avoiding major organs and blood vessels as much as possible. The goal was to have the stake emerge somewhere in the upper torso through the chest, shoulder, or even the mouth, while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. A skilled executioner could achieve impalement that would keep the victim alive for hours or even days. The positioning of the stake was crucial to the effectiveness of the punishment. The victim would be placed on the ground, and the sharpened stake would be carefully positioned and then driven upward through the body using hammers or other tools. The stake would then be erected vertically, with the victim's own weight helping to drive the wooden point deeper into their body. This self-impaling effect was part of the psychological horror of the punishment the victim was forced to participate in their own execution. The most documented case of Vlad's use of impalement occurred in 1460, when he dealt with a group of Ottoman envoys who had been sent to demand increased tribute payments. The Ottoman Empire had supported Vlad's rise to power, but they expected their Wallachian vassals to show proper submission and provide regular payments of gold, silver, and young men for the Janissary Corps. The envoys arrived at Vlad's court in Targovishte with all the ceremony appropriate to representatives of the Sultan. They wore magnificent turbans and robes, carried elaborately decorated weapons, and spoke with the confidence of men representing the world's most powerful empire. Their leader, a pasha named Hamza, had dealt with dozens of tributary princes and expected the usual mixture of submission, negotiation, and eventual compliance that characterize such diplomatic missions. But Vlad received the envoys with a courtesy that should have been warning enough to experienced diplomats. He welcomed them warmly, provided them with comfortable quarters, and promised to consider their demands carefully. He even expressed interest in visiting the Ottoman court personally to discuss the terms of Wallachia's tribute obligations. The envoys, pleased with this apparent cooperation, settled in to wait for the prince's formal response. The response came 3 days later, when Vlad's guards surrounded the envoys' quarters and arrested them all. The charge was insulting the dignity of the Prince of Wallachia. Apparently, the envoys had refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, claiming that Ottoman custom forbade them from uncovering their heads before anyone except the Sultan. This was a diplomatic nicety that had been overlooked by previous Wallachian princes, but Vlad chose to treat it as a mortal insult. The execution was carried out in the courtyard of the prince's castle, before an audience of boyars, foreign merchants, and other diplomats who happened to be at court. Vlad wanted witnesses to this demonstration of his independence from Ottoman authority, and he wanted those witnesses to carry word of what they had seen back to their home countries. The impalement of the Ottoman envoys was conducted with elaborate ceremony. Each man was brought forward individually, his crime proclaimed, and his sentence announced. The stakes had been prepared in advance, cut from oak trees and shaped by skilled carpenters, according to Vlad's specifications. The executioners were experienced men who understood the prince's requirements for prolonging the victim's suffering. Hamza, as the leader of the delegation, was reserved for last, forced to watch as his subordinates were impaled one by one. The process was slow and methodical, with careful attention paid to the proper positioning of each stake. The victims' screams echoed across the courtyard, and their struggles grew weaker as shock and blood loss began to take their toll. When Hamza's turn came, Vlad reportedly spoke to him directly, explaining that he was being punished not just for his personal insulting behavior, but as a message to the Sultan about Wallachia's attitude toward Ottoman demands for submission. The Pasha was then impaled with particular care, the stake positioned so that he would survive longer than his subordinates and suffer more dramatically. The impaled envoys were left in the courtyard for several days, their stakes arranged in a precise pattern that could be seen from the castle's windows and from the road leading to the main gate. Foreign visitors were encouraged to view the display, and detailed accounts of the executions were sent to courts throughout Europe. Vlad wanted the world to know that Wallachia would not submit quietly to Ottoman domination. But the impalement of the Ottoman envoys was only one example of Vlad's systematic use of this punishment. Throughout his reign, he employed impalement against a wide variety of victims, and for numerous different purposes. Boyars who plotted against him found themselves impaled alongside their entire families. Merchants who cheated in their dealings were impaled in the marketplaces where they had conducted their business. Criminals of all types, thieves, murderers, adulterers were impaled, rather than subjected to more traditional punishments. The scale of Vlad's impalement campaigns was unprecedented. Contemporary accounts, though often exaggerated, suggest that he may have ordered the impalement of tens of thousands of people during his relatively brief reign. Entire villages, suspected of collaboration with his enemies, were sometimes subjected to mass impalement, with the stakes arranged in geometric patterns that could be seen for miles. The most infamous of these mass impalements occurred in 1462, when Vlad was preparing to face a major Ottoman invasion led by Sultan Mehmed II himself. As the Ottoman army approached Wallachia, they encountered what chroniclers described as a forest of the impaled, thousands of stakes bearing the bodies of Ottoman prisoners, deserters, and collaborators arranged along the invasion route. The psychological effect on the Ottoman forces was exactly what Vlad had intended. Even the battle-hardened Janissaries, accustomed to the brutalities of constant warfare, were reportedly shaken by the sight of so many impaled bodies. The smell of decomposing flesh, the sight of ravens and vultures feeding on the corpses, and the knowledge that this was what awaited any Ottoman soldier who fell into Wallachian hands, all combined to create an atmosphere of dread that affected the entire army's morale. Sultan Mehmed himself, according to Ottoman chroniclers, was disturbed by the display. This was the same sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had ordered mass executions of his own, who was accustomed to the harsh realities of 15th century warfare. But even he found Vlad's methods excessive and unsettling. The forest of impaled bodies represented something beyond normal, military brutality. It was a deliberate attempt to terrorize through extreme cruelty. The technical aspects of mass impalement required considerable organization and resources, the preparation of thousands of stakes, the logistics of transporting and erecting them, the coordination of multiple execution teams, and the arrangement of the bodies in the desired patterns. All of this required planning and administrative skill that went far beyond simple sadism. Vlad had essentially industrialized impalement, transforming it from an occasional punishment into a systematic tool of governance and warfare. The religious dimensions of impalement in Vlad's Wallachia were complex and controversial. As a Christian prince fighting against Islamic expansion, Vlad could present his extreme methods as necessary for the defense of Christendom. Some contemporary chroniclers portrayed his cruelty as justified by the magnitude of the threat facing Christian Europe. The impaled Ottoman soldiers could be seen as sacrifices offered for the protection of the true faith. But this religious justification was problematic even by 15th century standards. The systematic torture and killing of prisoners was condemned by Christian teaching, regardless of their religion or nationality. Many European observers, while sympathetic to Vlad's anti-Ottoman stance, were disturbed by his methods and questioned whether such cruelty could ever be justified, even in defense of Christianity. The international reaction to Vlad's impalement campaigns was mixed, but generally negative. While some European courts appreciated having a buffer state that was willing to resist Ottoman expansion so vigorously, most were appalled by the reports of systematic torture and mass execution. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope both received detailed accounts of Vlad's methods, and both expressed concern about the impact such brutality might have on Christianity's reputation. The psychological portrait of Vlad that emerges from contemporary accounts is of a man who had systematically transformed himself into an instrument of terror. Unlike many rulers who used cruelty sporadically or in moments of rage, Vlad appears to have made calculated decisions about when, how, and whom to impale. He understood the propaganda value of extreme punishment and used it as a deliberate tool of statecraft. But the psychological cost of such systematic cruelty was enormous. Vlad became increasingly isolated, trusting no one completely and seeing potential enemies everywhere. His own followers began to fear him almost as much as his enemies did, knowing that any perceived slight or failure could result in impalement. The atmosphere of terror that he created to control his enemies eventually began to undermine his own support base. The military effectiveness of Vlad's terror tactics was limited and ultimately counterproductive. While the forest of impaled bodies may have initially shocked the Ottoman army, It also strengthened their resolve to destroy such a dangerous enemy. The Sultan's campaign of 1462, though initially disrupted by Vlad's psychological warfare, eventually succeeded in driving him from the throne. The extreme cruelty that was meant to deter invasion instead provoked a more determined invasion. The end of Vlad's reign came in 1476, when he was killed in battle against an Ottoman-supported rival claimant to the Wallachian throne. His death was unremarkable by the standards of his life. A simple sword thrust in the confusion of combat, nothing like the elaborate tortures he had inflicted on so many others. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where it was displayed as proof that the terrible impaler was finally dead. But Vlad's legacy lived on in ways he could never have anticipated. The stories of his cruelty spread throughout Europe, becoming the foundation for legends that would eventually evolve into the Dracula mythos. The historical Vlad became confused with vampires and supernatural monsters. His very real crimes transformed into Gothic fantasy. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to literary character reflects something important about how extreme cruelty is processed by human memory and imagination. The reality of systematic impalement, the careful planning, the administrative efficiency, the calculated psychology was perhaps too horrible to be remembered as mere history. It had to be transformed into something supernatural, something beyond normal human capacity for evil. Modern historians have struggled to separate the real Vlad from the legends that surrounded him. Some have attempted to rehabilitate his reputation by emphasizing his role as a defender of Christian Europe against Islamic expansion. Others have focused on the political and military pressures that shaped his reign, arguing that extreme measures were necessary for survival in the brutal world of 15th century Eastern Europe. But no historical context can entirely excuse or explain the systematic torture and murder that characterized Vlad's reign. His use of impalement went far beyond military necessity or even effective deterrence. It represented a deliberate choice to respond to the brutality of his age with even greater brutality, to meet terror with more refined terror, to answer cruelty with systematic cruelty. The story of Vlad the Impaler serves as a reminder that even in the darkest periods of human history, there are always choices to be made about how far one is willing to go in pursuit of power or survival. Vlad chose to go further than most, and in doing so, he created a legacy that has outlasted his political achievements, his military victories, and even his historical reputation. He became a symbol of the human capacity for evil, a warning about what happens when the pursuit of power overwhelms all moral constraints. Rat torture in Dutch revolt, 16th C. The ancient city of Haarlem stood defiant behind its medieval walls in the winter of 1572, as the cold winds swept across the flooded Dutch countryside and rattled the shutters of houses crowded within the city's protective embrace. This prosperous cloth-making centre had declared its allegiance to William of Orange and the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, a decision that had brought both hope and terror to its citizens. For outside the walls, the forces of Philip II's general, Don Fadrique de Toledo, were settling in for what would become one of the most bitter and brutal sieges of the 80 Years' War. The Spanish army that surrounded Haarlem was a formidable force, composed not only of Spanish tercios, the finest infantry in Europe, but also German mercenaries, Italian engineers, and Walloon cavalry. These men were veterans of campaigns across Europe, hardened by years of warfare and accustomed to the harsh realities of 16th century military life. They served a king who viewed the Dutch revolt not merely as political rebellion, but as heretical defiance of divine authority, a cancer that had to be cut out of the body of Christendom with whatever methods proved necessary. The defenders of Haarlem, led by Wigbold Ripperda, knew that their cause was desperate but not hopeless. Other Dutch cities had successfully resisted Spanish sieges, and there was always the possibility that William of Orange might arrive with a relief army. But as the winter dragged on and the siege tightened, it became clear that Haarlem would have to endure whatever the Spanish could inflict upon it. The siege followed the conventional patterns of 16th century warfare at first. the Spanish constructed elaborate earthworks and trenches, positioning their artillery to batter the city's walls. The defenders responded with sorties and counter-battery fire, making the besiegers pay for every yard of ground they gained. But as weeks turned into months, and the conventional approaches failed to produce quick results, the Spanish began to employ methods that went far beyond the accepted rules of military conduct. The innovation that would make the siege of Haarlem infamous in the annals of military cruelty was developed not by the Spanish commanders, but by their German mercenaries, men whose experience in the religious wars that had ravaged the Holy Roman Empire had taught them that psychological warfare could be as effective as artillery. They had observed that captured enemy soldiers who survived conventional torture often maintained their defiance, but men who faced more exotic punishments sometimes broke completely, providing valuable intelligence and serving as powerful deterrents to further resistance. The method they developed was both ingenious and horrifying in its simplicity. Captured Dutch soldiers would be stripped and bound securely to a wooden frame, their torsos exposed. Then an iron bowl or helmet would be placed upside down on the victim's stomach, and several live rats would be trapped inside. The bowl would be heated with coals or torches from above, creating an increasingly unbearable environment for the rodents trapped within. The psychological horror of this torture was carefully calculated. Rats are intelligent animals that will go to extraordinary lengths to escape confinement and discomfort. As the metal bowl became hotter, the rats would become increasingly frantic, clawing and biting at anything they could reach. The only escape available to them was through the soft flesh of the victim's abdomen, and driven by desperation, they would begin to chew and tear their way through skin, muscle, and eventually into the body cavity itself. The first recorded use of this torture occurred in February 1573, when Spanish forces captured a group of Dutch soldiers during a failed sortie against the siege works. Among the prisoners was a young man named Peter van der Meer, a cloth merchant's son who had taken up arms to defend his city. Under normal circumstances, van der Meer might have expected to be held for ransom or exchanged for Spanish prisoners. But the siege had dragged on longer than anticipated. Spanish morale was suffering from the cold and the stubborn Dutch resistance, and Don Fadrique was under pressure from Madrid to bring the rebellion to a quick conclusion. The German mercenary captain who suggested the rat torture argued that it would serve multiple purposes. First, it might extract valuable information about the city's defenses and supply situation. Second, it would provide a spectacular example of what awaited other captured rebels. Third, it might demoralize the defenders sufficiently to encourage surrender. The combination of practical intelligence gathering and psychological warfare was appealing to commanders who had grown frustrated with conventional siege tactics. Van der Meer was selected as the first victim, partly because of his youth. The Spanish hoped that a young man might break more easily than a hardened soldier, and partly because intelligence suggested that his family was well connected within the city. Information extracted from him might be particularly valuable, and word of his suffering might carry special weight with the defenders. The torture was carried out in view of the city walls, where defenders could witness what was happening to their captured comrade. Van der Meer was bound to the wooden frame with elaborate care, ensuring that he could not move enough to dislodge the bowl or interfere with the rat's desperate attempts to escape. The iron helmet taken from a fallen Spanish soldier was positioned precisely on his abdomen, and 3 large rats were trapped inside. Contemporary accounts of what followed are difficult to read even centuries later. As the bowl was heated, the rat's behavior became increasingly frantic. Van der Meer's screams could be heard clearly on the city walls, and Spanish soldiers reported that some of the Dutch defenders turned away from their posts, unable to watch their comrades' agony. The process took several hours, as the rats worked their way through layers of flesh and muscle, driven by an increasingly desperate need to escape the heated confines of their metal prison. The intelligence value of the torture was limited. Van der Meer, driven mad by pain and terror, provided rambling and often contradictory information that proved largely useless to the Spanish commanders. But the psychological impact was enormous. Word of the rat torture spread rapidly through the besieged city, creating an atmosphere of dread that went beyond the normal fears of war and siege. The method was employed several more times during the siege, with variations designed to maximize the psychological impact. Some victims were tortured within earshot of the walls, but out of sight, so that the defenders could hear the screams without being able to see exactly what was happening. Others were subjected to the torture in full view of the city, with Spanish soldiers using mirrors and polished metal to reflect sunlight toward the walls, ensuring that the defenders had a clear view of their comrades' suffering. The religious dimensions of the rat torture were particularly troubling to contemporaries. The rats were seen as unclean animals, associated with plague, disease, and moral corruption. To be devoured alive by such creatures was viewed as a form of spiritual as well as physical degradation, a punishment that contaminated the soul as well as destroying the body. Catholic theologians attached to the Spanish army struggled to justify the practice within the framework of Christian just war theory, while Protestant ministers in Harlem preached sermons denouncing it as evidence of Spanish moral corruption. The military effectiveness of the rat torture was questionable and ultimately counterproductive. While it did succeed in terrorizing the defenders, it also strengthened their resolve to resist surrender, knowing that capitulation might result in even worse treatment. The torture also horrified many Spanish and Allied soldiers who had not signed up for service in what increasingly resembled a war against basic human decency. Morale problems began to appear in the Spanish camp, as soldiers questioned whether such methods were worthy of a Christian army serving a Catholic king. The international reaction to reports of the rat torture was swift and condemnatory. Protestant courts throughout Europe seized upon accounts of Spanish cruelty as evidence of Catholic barbarity and justification for supporting the Dutch revolt. Even Catholic rulers expressed private concern about methods that seemed to exceed the bounds of civilized warfare. The Spanish crown found itself in the awkward position of either defending torture methods it had not officially authorized or disciplining commanders who had been trying to achieve the objectives Madrid had demanded. The siege of Harlem finally ended in July 1573, when the city surrendered after running out of food and ammunition. The terms of surrender had been negotiated with the understanding that the garrison and civilian population would be treated according to the conventional rules of war. But Don Fadrique, perhaps influenced by the brutality that had characterized the siege, ordered mass executions of the defenders despite the agreed terms. Nearly 2,000 people were killed, including many who had been promised safe conduct. The rat torture episodes were later documented by multiple sources, including Spanish military records, Dutch chronicles, and the accounts of foreign observers who had witnessed the siege. These records provide unusually detailed information about the development and use of this particular torture method, allowing historians to trace its evolution and assess its impact on contemporary military culture. The technique appears to have been used sporadically in other conflicts during the later 16th and early 17th centuries, but it never became a standard military practice. Most commanders recognized that such extreme methods were likely to be counterproductive, alienating potential allies and stiffening enemy resistance. The rat torture remained an aberration, associated primarily with the particular circumstances of the Dutch revolt and the religious hatred that characterized that conflict. The psychological profile of the German mercenaries who developed and employed the rat torture reveals something disturbing about the professionalization of violence in early modern Europe. These were not sadistic monsters, but experienced soldiers who had developed their methods through years of practical experience in warfare. Rat torture in Dutch revolt, 16th C. The ancient city of Haarlem stood defiant behind its medieval walls in the winter of 1572, as the cold winds swept across the flooded Dutch countryside and rattled the shutters of houses crowded within the city's protective embrace. This prosperous cloth-making centre had declared its allegiance to William of Orange and the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, a decision that had brought both hope and terror to its citizens. For outside the walls, the forces of Philip II's general, Don Fadrique de Toledo, were settling in for what would become one of the most bitter and brutal sieges of the 80 Years' War. The Spanish army that surrounded Haarlem was a formidable force, composed not only of Spanish tercios, the finest infantry in Europe, but also German mercenaries, Italian engineers, and Walloon cavalry. These men were veterans of campaigns across Europe, hardened by years of warfare and accustomed to the harsh realities of 16th century military life. They served a king who viewed the Dutch revolt not merely as political rebellion, but as heretical defiance of divine authority, a cancer that had to be cut out of the body of Christendom with whatever methods proved necessary. The defenders of Haarlem, led by Wigbold Ripperda, knew that their cause was desperate but not hopeless. Other Dutch cities had successfully resisted Spanish sieges, and there was always the possibility that William of Orange might arrive with a relief army. But as the winter dragged on and the siege tightened, it became clear that Haarlem would have to endure whatever the Spanish could inflict upon it. The siege followed the conventional patterns of 16th century warfare at first. The Spanish constructed elaborate earthworks and trenches, positioning their artillery to batter the city's walls. The defenders responded with sorties and counter-battery fire, making the besiegers pay for every yard of ground they gained. But as weeks turned into months, and the conventional approaches failed to produce quick results, the Spanish began to employ methods that went far beyond the accepted rules of military conduct. The innovation that would make the siege of Haarlem infamous in the annals of military cruelty was developed not by the Spanish commanders, but by their German mercenaries, men whose experience in the religious wars that had ravaged the Holy Roman Empire had taught them that psychological warfare could be as effective as artillery. They had observed that captured enemy soldiers who survived conventional torture often maintained their defiance, but men who faced more exotic punishments sometimes broke completely, providing valuable intelligence and serving as powerful deterrents to further resistance. The method they developed was both ingenious and horrifying in its simplicity. Captured Dutch soldiers would be stripped and bound securely to a wooden frame, their torsos exposed. Then an iron bowl or helmet would be placed upside down on the victim's stomach, and several live rats would be trapped inside. The bowl would be heated with coals or torches from above, creating an increasingly unbearable environment for the rodents trapped within. The psychological horror of this torture was carefully calculated. Rats are intelligent animals that will go to extraordinary lengths to escape confinement and discomfort. As the metal bowl became hotter, the rats would become increasingly frantic, clawing and biting at anything they could reach. The only escape available to them was through the soft flesh of the victim's abdomen, and driven by desperation, they would begin to chew and tear their way through skin, muscle, and eventually into the body cavity itself. The first recorded use of this torture occurred in February 1573, when Spanish forces captured a group of Dutch soldiers during a failed sortie against the siege works. Among the prisoners was a young man named Peter van der Meer, a cloth merchant's son who had taken up arms to defend his city. Under normal circumstances, van der Meer might have expected to be held for ransom or exchanged for Spanish prisoners. But the siege had dragged on longer than anticipated. Spanish morale was suffering from the cold and the stubborn Dutch resistance, and Don Fadrique was under pressure from Madrid to bring the rebellion to a quick conclusion. The German mercenary captain who suggested the rat torture argued that it would serve multiple purposes. First, it might extract valuable information about the city's defenses and supply situation. Second, it would provide a spectacular example of what awaited other captured rebels. Third, it might demoralize the defenders sufficiently to encourage surrender. The combination of practical intelligence gathering and psychological warfare was appealing to commanders who had grown frustrated with conventional siege tactics. Van der Meer was selected as the first victim, partly because of his youth. The Spanish hoped that a young man might break more easily than a hardened soldier. and partly because intelligence suggested that his family was well connected within the city. Information extracted from him might be particularly valuable, and word of his suffering might carry special weight with the defenders. The torture was carried out in view of the city walls, where defenders could witness what was happening to their captured comrade. Vandermeer was bound to the wooden frame with elaborate care, ensuring that he could not move enough to dislodge the bowl or interfere with the rat's desperate attempts to escape. The iron helmet taken from a fallen Spanish soldier was positioned precisely on his abdomen, and 3 large rats were trapped inside. Contemporary accounts of what followed are difficult to read even centuries later. As the bowl was heated, the rat's behavior became increasingly frantic. Vandermeer's screams could be heard clearly on the city walls, and Spanish soldiers reported that some of the Dutch defenders turned away from their posts, unable to watch their comrades' agony. The process took several hours, as the rats worked their way through layers of flesh and muscle, driven by an increasingly desperate need to escape the heated confines of their metal prison. The intelligence value of the torture was limited. Vandermeer, driven mad by pain and terror, provided rambling and often contradictory information that proved largely useless to the Spanish commanders. But the psychological impact was enormous. Word of the rat torture spread rapidly through the besieged city, creating an atmosphere of dread that went beyond the normal fears of war and siege. The method was employed several more times during the siege, with variations designed to maximize the psychological impact. Some victims were tortured within earshot of the walls, but out of sight, so that the defenders could hear the screams without being able to see exactly what was happening. Others were subjected to the torture in full view of the city, with Spanish soldiers using mirrors and polished metal to reflect sunlight toward the walls, ensuring that the defenders had a clear view of their comrades' suffering. The religious dimensions of the rat torture were particularly troubling to contemporaries. The rats were seen as unclean animals, associated with plague, disease, and moral corruption. To be devoured alive by such creatures was viewed as a form of spiritual as well as physical degradation, a punishment that contaminated the soul as well as destroying the body. Catholic theologians attached to the Spanish army struggled to justify the practice within the framework of Christian just war theory, while Protestant ministers in Harlem preached sermons denouncing it as evidence of Spanish moral corruption. The military effectiveness of the rat torture was questionable and ultimately counterproductive. While it did succeed in terrorizing the defenders, it also strengthened their resolve to resist surrender, knowing that capitulation might result in even worse treatment. The torture also horrified many Spanish and Allied soldiers who had not signed up for service in what increasingly resembled a war against basic human decency. Morale problems began to appear in the Spanish camp, as soldiers questioned whether such methods were worthy of a Christian army serving a Catholic king. The international reaction to reports of the rat torture was swift and condemnatory. Protestant courts throughout Europe seized upon accounts of Spanish cruelty as evidence of Catholic barbarity and justification for supporting the Dutch revolt. Even Catholic rulers expressed private concern about methods that seemed to exceed the bounds of civilized warfare. The Spanish crown found itself in the awkward position of either defending torture methods it had not officially authorized or disciplining commanders who had been trying to achieve the objectives Madrid had demanded. The siege of Harlem finally ended in July 1573, when the city surrendered after running out of food and ammunition. The terms of surrender had been negotiated with the understanding that the garrison and civilian population would be treated according to the conventional rules of war. But Don Fadrique, perhaps influenced by the brutality that had characterized the siege, ordered mass executions of the defenders despite the agreed terms. Nearly 2,000 people were killed, including many who had been promised safe conduct. The rat torture episodes were later documented by multiple sources, including Spanish military records, Dutch chronicles, and the accounts of foreign observers who had witnessed the siege. These records provide unusually detailed information about the development and use of this particular torture method, allowing historians to trace its evolution and assess its impact on contemporary military culture. The technique appears to have been used sporadically in other conflicts during the later 16th and early 17th centuries, but it never became a standard military practice. Most commanders recognized that such extreme methods were likely to be counterproductive, alienating potential allies and stiffening enemy resistance. The rat torture remained an aberration, associated primarily with the particular circumstances of the Dutch revolt and the religious hatred that characterized that conflict. The psychological profile of the German mercenaries who developed and employed the rat torture reveals something disturbing about the professionalization of violence in early modern Europe. These were not sadistic monsters, but experienced soldiers who had developed their methods through years of practical experience in warfare.